All right, looks like we've got the go-ahead to get going. So good afternoon and welcome to the Housing Summit 3.0, Driving Solutions to the Crisis. This event is presented by RESCON and sponsored by the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Toronto, and Stories. My name is Corinne Lenz. I'm Vice President of Content and Partnerships at Actual Media, and I will be your host for today. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build housing that benefits all Canadians. Now, before I hand the floor over to Richard for opening remarks, I'd like to share a little bit of housekeeping information about our virtual event today. First off, the summit is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording on the RESCON website, and you'll also find a link to the post-event summary there. In that post-event summary, you'll find lots of valuable information, including speaker bios, key takeaways from the sessions, and any resources or reports that our speakers share with us today. We value your participation in this virtual summit, and for that reason, we encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A function. Please try to submit your questions during the sessions that they're related to, and we'll do our best, the other moderators and myself, to make sure as many questions as possible get answered. So stay comfortable. It's a packed agenda featuring multiple sessions. We encourage you to stretch your legs and move around as needed. Now, I'd like to introduce Richard Lyall for our opening remarks. Richard is president of the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, fondly known as RESCON, and has represented the residential construction industry in Ontario since 1991. Richard, take it away.
Thanks, Corinne. Let me begin by welcoming you to the third annual RESCON Housing Summit 3.0. We appreciate your joining us today. Your participation shows your strong commitment to working collaboratively to address the housing crisis in the province. We are fortunate to have such an amazing lineup of participants in our program, and I thank all of them for taking the time to be with us. Our work is of critical importance. We hear of housing being a human right at the same time as it is for many people the most precarious part of their lives now. We must remember that stable and affordable housing is of utmost importance to families and individuals. It is the foundation upon which all other success in life is based. If you don't have a safe, secure, and stable place to call home, it is very difficult to be a good employee, a good student, get a start, or a fully functioning, participating member of society. Not because of any shortcomings in those who have precarious living conditions, but because housing is the anchor that allows people to thrive in their given communities. For years, many of us have raised the alarm about where we have been heading in terms of what we now call the housing crisis. Our advocacy has taken many forms over the last 2 decades, with research and reports which have highlighted where action by government and others is needed to be taken in areas such as infrastructure, taxes, skills, technology. A most recent report we participated in concerned what are the taxes, fees, and levies on new housing. And the result was, by CANCEA, was 31%. And of course, not long after that, BC did a similar study, and their number was 30%. And that's like a sin tax. You know, we're taxing housing like alcohol. Doesn't really make sense. There is little value, though, in assessing blame and pointing fingers at this stage or at various levels. Our responsibility must be focused on solutions. All levels of government, all private sector partners, and all housing stakeholders have a role to play. And a piece of good news is that everyone now agrees we need to build the province's target of 1.5 million homes in the next decade. Builders in this province want to build homes. They understand the need to build more supply and have always delivered within the constraints of what is allowed. This continued even during the COVID pandemic, when the industry stayed working by implementing our health measures that kept workers safe and homes being built. We're at the crossroads of a generational crisis in housing, however. It's unprecedented. And when you get to the point where the middle class can't afford housing, you know you have a serious problem. We are uniquely placed to change the direction we have been heading in terms of providing the housing our people need. And if it's not for reasons of compassion, caring, and concern that we move to address the housing crisis, surely it is for the benefit of the comfortable as well, given the consequences of failure for all. Economically, no society can excel without young people moving up to build future economic prosperity. And yet many of our talented young people are choosing to leave our cities and our province because they simply can't find an affordable place to call home. We must turn this tide. And frankly, we have a dual responsibility when it comes to changing what is happening with respect to housing availability and affordability. As much as it is our responsibility to comfort the afflicted, so to speak, it's also our duty to afflict the comfortable. Those who live in established cities or towns, undeveloped neighborhoods must simply recognize and accept that change must occur. We need to densify our available land. We need to build more housing urgently, and governments must continue to take action to reduce costs and impediments to building housing. Our country needs immigration as our birth rates are low, but we cannot in good conscience continue to invite newcomers to our shores when they have no prospect of finding an affordable or decent place to call home. I believe we are here today because we care and because we want to find and implement solutions. Let's do just that and trust that generations to come will look upon this time and say, we answered the call and we got the job done. In our cities, our province, and our country, we're all the better for it. Thank you to all who joined the Housing Summit today. And in particular, thank you to the participants participating in the program. Finally, a special thank you to our sponsors, Federation of Rental Housing Providers and Toronto Regional Real Estate Board and Stories. And now I would like to turn your attention to greetings from our Premier. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all, the Housing Summit 3.0. To start, I want to give a big thank you to everyone at RESCON for bringing us together today and for hosting this important conference. I also want to acknowledge the impressive list of panelists, including Mayor Chow, Mayor Guthrie, and Mayor Salonen, economists and researchers, and industry leaders from across the sector. As everyone here knows, Ontario is growing at an unprecedented speed. That's why it's never been more important to deliver on our commitment to build at minimum 1.5 million homes. Failing to act would only make the housing supply and affordability crisis worse. Together, we need to build more homes. We need to change the way we build homes, building more density in growing cities, close to transit, using modular homes, starter homes, to make home ownership more attainable for young families and newcomers, and cutting through red tape to speed up approvals. We need to work together with our municipal partners, our federal government, our builders and developers to build more homes of all types, including a mix of ownership, rental, nonprofit, and supportive housing. And friends, it's so great to see forums like this, where we can all come together to discuss solutions to tackle the housing crisis. Thank you again for inviting me to speak. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and may God bless the people of Ontario.
Well, thank you to Premier Ford for kicking us off. We have an incredible lineup of speakers ahead of us and a tight schedule to keep. But before I dive in, I'd like to point out the Q&A feature one more time to just encourage all of you to ask your questions throughout the panel discussions, and our moderators and myself will do our best to make sure we answer those questions. All right, let's get started. I have the privilege of introducing Jason Mercer, who's going to give us a lay of the land with his presentation of the current state of the housing crisis. Jason is the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board's Chief Market Analyst and Director of Service Channels. He leads, and I want to say this is TRREB's or TRREB's market analysis program that provides products and services that help realtors and their clients fully understand trends in the GTA housing market and underlying economic drivers. Jason has private and public sector experience in the real estate industry, having previously held positions at PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. A little bit more here. Jason is a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners, a registered professional planner with the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, and a member of Lambda Alpha International, the Land Economic Society. So I think he is well qualified to speak with us today. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. What I'll do here is I will share my PowerPoint. Maybe someone from RESCON can let me know if you could see the main slideshow.
No, you'll need to switch it. Oh, that's good.
That's good. All right, sounds like there's a bit of a delay. All right, well, let me know if anything goes south and I can stop and back up if need be. But what I want to do over the next 15, 20 minutes or so, and I think there'll be time for a couple of questions at the end, is just sort of go through the current state of the housing market and the GTA and broader Greater Golden Horseshoe. And just sort of start off, I mean, Richard mentioned in his opening remarks that it's a bit of a precarious situation in the housing market, not only in the GTA, but across Canada and in other parts of the world as well. And a large part of that has to do with inflation and the action that central banks have been taking to combat inflation, namely aggressive rate hikes over the better part of the last couple of years. And what this chart points out, and this is just sort of looking at the first 12 months of rate tightening cycle since 1987, and by far, what we've seen over the last year and a half have been the most aggressive in terms of rate hikes, and we've seen that impact play out in the housing market over the last number of months, and to a certain degree, that impact was delayed, and we saw an initial impact back in 2022. We saw a little bit of a rebound at the beginning of this year when there was some uncertainty around where the market was headed, and now we've actually seen a downward trend again in terms of sales and selling prices. So quite simply, if you look at the history of the Bank of Canada's overnight lending rate, we're now at more than a 2-decade high. And we got to that more than 2-decade high in an extremely short period of time. And what that means is that, a lot of households who have every intention of purchasing a home at some point in the future are concerned that now is not the time, and they've moved to the sidelines. And obviously, there's a lot of other factors that are playing into that. People are concerned with inflation, and that's what got us to where we are today in terms of borrowing costs. What this chart shows is the annual change in StatsCan's consumer price index on the top, and then on the bottom is the annualized monthly change. And by either metric, things were looking really good as we move through the second half of 2022 and even through the first half of 2023, as the rate of inflation was trending lower, which obviously was by design. As we see interest rates go up, the hope is that people will put some of their spending decisions on hold. It costs more to borrow money, and that'll see less upward pressure on prices in all different segments of the economy, specifically those pointed at consumers. The issue, though, of course, is that as we move through the summer and into the fall, we actually saw the rate of inflation bottom out, and now it started to trend back upwards. And that's because this rate tightening cycle and the impact of those higher rates, the impact has been a little bit different. Whereas the housing market was impacted fairly quickly, not all sectors of the economy were impacted in the same fashion. And some of that has to do with the fact that labor markets have behaved differently. If you think back to some of those rate tightening cycles we talked about earlier in this presentation, rapidly increasing borrowing costs also correlated with an upward trend in the unemployment rate. And we didn't see that. And so we continue to see consumer spending. We continue to see growth in prices as a result. And of course, the concern is that we'll continue to see upward pressure on borrowing costs as we move through the second half of this year. And so again, as I mentioned, the unemployment rate in the GTA, while it has trended upwards a little bit as the economy has slowed down, it still remains very, very low from an historic perspective. And to a certain degree, that's a good thing. If it remains at this at a lower level, it means that recovery of some sectors of the economy, midway through 2024 and beyond, including housing, will take hold at a faster pace, and that's obviously good. I mean, another thing that Richard mentioned in his opening remarks is the economic impact of the housing industry in general. So you think about home sales on a resale basis, you think about new home construction in the Greater Toronto Area. That's attached to a lot of different expenditures. The spin-offs from home sales and home construction are huge, billions of dollars per year, and a lot of those spin-offs are very much local. And so it'll be important to see a quick recovery in housing, and to a certain degree a relatively tight labor market will help that, because it speaks to consumer confidence. And so if we think about sale prices, obviously we've seen a change over the last year and a half or so. Through 2021 and through the first couple months of 2022, we'd seen a very rapid acceleration in home prices. But as we started to see the Bank of Canada increase its policy rate, and as that fed through into bond markets and medium-term mortgages like the 5-year fixed rate mortgage, that did prompt, number one, a pullback in home sales, but number two, some changes in how aggressive people were prepared to be with offers they were making on homes. Essentially, offers had to trend lower in order to mitigate some of the impact of a higher borrowing costs. What we saw as we moved through the spring was a bit of an upward blip. I mean, if you think back in the first quarter and even beginning of the second quarter of this year, we'd seen the Silicon Valley Bank issue and how that spread to other lending institutions. And the notion was that we were basically at an end of interest rate hikes, and quite possibly we could even be seeing interest rate cuts at the end of 2023. And that sent a bit of a mini signal, if you will, to some market participants that they're going to start moving back into the marketplace. And we did see a tightening in the housing market and upward pressure on home prices as a result. But as we've seen, inflation turn around and go in the wrong direction over the last 2 to 3 months, the odds of further rate increases have become higher. And as a result, we've seen people move back to the sidelines, and we have seen, downward pressure on selling prices over the last couple of months as a result as well. And it's hampered home sales as well. Obviously, when you think about home sales over the last year and a half or so, again, we saw that a bit of a blip as we moved through the early spring of this year. But essentially, we carved 30 to 40% on a year-over-year basis out of the housing market activity over a very short period of time, from say January of 2022 through the spring of last year. So there's no doubt about it. The aggressive pace of rate increases can be easily seen just looking at home sales in the GTA and nothing else. But that's where I want to depart from, the demand side and the impact that inflation, the impact that higher borrowing costs have had on the demand for ownership housing, and talk more about, what we expect to see in the medium to long term. And the bottom line is, and again, sort of picking up on some of Richard's points, we continue to see, record or near record pace of population growth coming into our region and the surrounding Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so there's no doubt that we're going to see demand move back to levels that we saw in 2021 and 2022, either as interest rates trend lower, perhaps in the second half of next year, or just more and more households become accustomed to this higher rate environment, because the bottom line is people are going to require a place to live. And so again, we're seeing record levels of immigration, and don't forget, the GTA is the single greatest beneficiary across the country of newcomers moving to Canada. They want to take advantage of the economic diversity we have in our region, creating jobs across a number of different sectors, catering to a number of different skill sets from people all around the world. They also obviously want to take advantage of, benefit from the cultural diversity that we have in the GTA as well. And so the expectation should be continued population growth, either at record or near record levels for the foreseeable future. And so really what we need to think about is how we're going to house all these people. And that's whether you're thinking about the rental market or the ownership market. Because the bottom line is that over time, if people don't feel comfortable with their ability to move to Canada, and specifically the GTA or broader Greater Golden Horseshoe, they're going to start to look elsewhere. And that'll be to the detriment of not only the GTA, but Canada as a whole. Because it's not necessarily the case that if they don't feel comfortable moving to the GTA, that these households are going to move to Canada. They can look to other points around the world as well. And that would be, to the detriment of our country's economic development. But the bottom line is that over the last decade or more, we have not seen home construction keep up with population growth. And what this chart plots out here is just straight up completions on the blue line. And then what I've done is I've netted out condominium apartment completions that find their way into the rental market. So investors purchasing properties and then upon completion, renting them out to tenants. And if you look at that gray line, you really see that sort of downward trend in pure ownership completions over the last decade to decade and a half. And it goes a long way to explaining why market conditions became so tight leading up to the interest rate hikes. Quite simply, there was just intense competition between most households that were out there looking to purchase a home in our region. And you see that how that plays through into listings. Essentially, the number of new listings had flatlined over that same period of time, yet the demand for ownership housing had continued to trend upwards. And so right now we're in a lull in the marketplace. We're seeing demand has tapered off as a result of high borrowing costs. So that's a real short-term phenomenon. I think it would be a real danger for policymakers looking at the supply side of the market to say, hey, we could take our foot off the gas a little bit in terms of measures we could take to bring more supply on the market because the market slowed down. The market will turn around really, really quickly once we have a little bit more clarity in terms of where we're going with borrowing costs and how the regional economy is going to react, because the population is continuing to grow. We know what's going on in the rental market right now. Things will tighten up very, very quickly again on the ownership side. And just one of my last slides here is just looking at the rental market and how quickly things can turn around. How quickly things can change. We saw a real spike upwards in terms of vacancy rates, both in the primary rental market in blue and the secondary, investor condo market, et cetera, in red during the pandemic. But look how quickly things turned around as we move through 2022. We're almost back down to record lows in terms of vacancy rates. And I believe that when CMHC releases its rental market survey results early in the new year, we'll see that vacancy rate even trended lower over the last 12 months. So the bottom line, whether we're talking about ownership housing, whether we're talking about rental housing, we continue to have a serious supply issue. So I'll wrap up with a couple of points. Number one, home construction hasn't kept up with population growth over the past 2 decades, but it's key for this population growth to continue. If we want to see continued economic growth, if we want to see continued economic competitiveness in our region, and the danger is that newcomers will look elsewhere around the world if they don't feel they can obtain affordable housing within the GTA. And the issue is that not only do we have to account for the housing deficit that's built up over the last, say, decade to decade and a half, but we're also going to need to account for above average household formation in the foreseeable future. And this means that policymakers have to act now. And make no mistake, if we were having this discussion 5 years ago, and some of you have heard me say this before, if we were having this discussion on supply 5 years ago, I'd be accused of sort of throwing a red herring into the mix. People saying, we didn't like the demand side policies, so we're trying to cast light in a different direction. But, I think it's fair to say that all 3 levels of government now understand that there's a housing supply crisis in the Greater Toronto area. So it's great to have that understanding in place. The next step, though, is to actually see shovels in the ground. And I know there'll be other conversations later on in the day, both on panels and presentations, talking about some of those solutions. So I think I'll leave it there. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take a couple.
Fantastic. There isn't a question yet from our audience, but I have one for you. Are there any geographic areas within the GTA experiencing unique housing market dynamics? And if so, what factors contribute to these differences?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that TRREB did, I think it was 3 years ago now, in conjunction with our year in review and outlook report, was we hired a well-known firm in Toronto, Urban Strategies, to kind of give us a sense of, what that concept of missing middle looks like. So, looking at traditional single family neighborhoods in the city of Toronto and surrounding regions to say, well, what's the art of the possible, looking at other jurisdictions around Canada and around the world in terms of bringing in sort of more mid-density housing, a greater diversity of home types in neighborhoods. And, I mean, you can go to the TRREB website and check out the report, but there's a lot of, great options and home types that I think people would be really happy to see in their neighborhood. But we haven't seen a lot of that actually take place. We haven't seen a lot of that development. In dribs and drabs, we've seen ancillary housing, laneway, and what have you. But nothing that's going to really sort of overcome the housing supply shortage. And I think it's those neighborhoods where we're going to continue to see, really tight market conditions if we don't see a greater diversity of home types get built, because it's really in those areas where we can see a greater continuum of housing if we do things right, where people can, say initially buy a condo apartment, then buy a town, then buy a semi, then buy a detached home, sort of moving through that housing life cycle as their situation dictates over time.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question that's just come in. So in terms of housing starts, how diverse is the end product in terms of price in the Toronto GTA?
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I think that's a nice segue from my previous answer, in the sense that, I mean, housing starts in the GTA by and large over the last couple of decades have been at either end of the spectrum, polarized, if you will. Where on the one hand, we've seen a lot more condominium apartment construction, especially in the city of Toronto, and some condo nodes, say in York region and Peel region, which is catered to a more sort of quote unquote affordable end of the spectrum, first time buyers and what have you, and obviously bringing on rental from investors. And then on the other hand, we've seen a lot of traditional single detached home construction, not as much of the in between. And again, that gets back to the point where, we do need to see more of that in between, whether we're talking about, townhomes, but even more importantly, plexes and what have you, being sort of not, integrated into larger greenfield type development. But then also seeing more of that type of construction in existing built up areas. And I think that would allow for, a greater diversity of home prices and allow for that movement through the housing continuum on an affordable basis over time.
Right. Thank you. I think we have another question just popping up here. Well, let's chat. All right. I have another question for you. I think we probably have time for one more here. How does the current state of the GTA housing market compare to historical trends? I think you mentioned a little bit in your presentation, but what are the key drivers behind the differences or similarities?
I think one of the key differences here, again, broken record, but back to sort of the supply side. Like if you think back to one of the charts that I showed where we were looking at new listings. Back in the early 2000s, so let's say from 2001 up until say the Great Recession, you're seeing new listings behave properly, right? You're seeing this scenario where as prices increased, that was a signal to people. Well, look, I've seen a lot of equity build up in my home, and so I'm going to list my home for sale in order to tap that equity and move into something different. Maybe I'm going to take that equity and buy a larger home because my family situation has changed. Maybe I'm a more aged household, and I'm going to tap into some of that equity, buy something smaller, and use it for retirement. The issue is that, as we started to see the supply situation compound, as we started to see, population growth outstripping our ability to bring on new homes, it started to become tougher and tougher for people to sort of think about, well, prices are up, but if I list my home for sale, where am I going to move? It's getting harder and harder to find a home for sale. And that's part of the thing. We've almost been spinning our wheels to a certain degree, more renovations. We've been changing the housing stock forever because of these renovations. And so there's a bit more of a flatlining in on the supply side, which, drove the well above inflation price increases we saw over the past decade.
Right. We seem like we have an influx of questions. And just a reminder to our audience, there's a Q&A feature, and a few of the questions are coming into the chat as well. So we're going to tackle the one here in the question first. So is it not a strategy to increase supply by restricting short-term leasing such as Airbnb? Further, are there not policies that can be put in place, such as higher end institutions being required to provide housing for their students?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, obviously some various policy initiatives on the part of local governments focused on the rental market. One thing we could talk about is the vacancy tax in the city of Toronto, and the notion there is really it ought to be a tax that doesn't really bring in much revenue, if any at all, for the municipality, because the notion ought to be, people that don't want to pay that tax should either list their unit for sale or list it for rent. The concern that I have is that we actually are seeing, an uptick in revenues accruing to the city from that tax. And so the concern is perhaps it's not working, that you're still going to have people willing to pay the tax and units remain vacant, which from a supply perspective isn't great. And so, the city of Toronto, I know they consulted with a lot of groups, TRREB, probably RESCON as well, sort of thinking about, how are we going to roll this out? And do we need to audit it? Well, I would suggest that if I were auditing, that policy right now, I'd be concerned that, we're seeing an upward trend in revenue. What we ought to be seeing is a downward trend in vacant units.
Okay. Got questions coming in everywhere. I think we have 1 minute before to keep us on schedule
One
here.
more.
So let's see what's squeezed in. So to what extent does financialization of housing impact supply? If we're just building more homes, how can we ensure that those homes will actually get to the people who need them?
Yeah, the financialization argument's an interesting one, because oftentimes we'll have people saying, well, look at how can we build more homes without investors taking part in the marketplace? And it's a double-edged sword. Like, I understand where people are coming from when they say, look, at investors are buying units and they're keeping them vacant, and they don't benefit people who want to move to our region to live and work and what have you. But by the same token, the only rental supply on net that's come into the marketplace in any large number has been investor-held condominium apartments over the last decade. And so if not for individual investors looking to purchase a unit and then make a return on that investment by bringing it into the rental market, we'd have an even more dire crisis on the rental market side than they do today. So again, it's a tough discussion, and one where you could debate all night about it. But for certain, without investors in the marketplace purchasing units over the last decade and bringing them to bear on the rental market, we would have had a bigger problem.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we're going to be debating a little bit about it this afternoon still anyway, so I'm sure it'll come up. Thank you so much. This has been a really insightful presentation. We've had a few moments here as we transition now to our mayor's panel discussion on the housing crisis. So if you need a moment to refresh your coffee or grab some water, here's your opportunity. So we're going to be starting back again at 1:10. So we'll meet you back here in just a few moments. Welcome back. All right, so after Jason's presentation, we have a pretty good understanding of where we're currently at. Now we're going to hear directly from the municipalities in our mayor's panel discussion. We're very fortunate to have with us today 3 mayors from municipalities of differing sizes to share their experiences. I'm going to hand you over to Michael Giles, Director of Municipal Affairs at RESCON. Michael has worked at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government over a period of 30 years. During his public service career, he has been engaged on a wide variety of files. In his most recent position, he served as Chief of Staff to the City of Toronto's Deputy Mayor and Chair of the Planning and Housing Committee, where he worked on planning and development issues, as well as multiple municipal files. Michael will be your moderator for the mayor's panel discussion, so I'm going to hand him over to your capable hands, Michael.
Thank you very much. Again, Michael Giles, and I liked everything about the introduction except the 30-year part. That sort of ages me a bit, but I wanted to welcome everyone to the mayor's panel of the RESCON Housing Summit 3.0. As Corinne mentioned, we're very fortunate to have 3 of our country's best mayors, and that's editorializing a little bit, but 3 of our country's best mayors joining us today. Mayor Olivia Chow is the mayor of the City of Toronto. She was elected the 66th mayor of the City of Toronto on June 28th of this year, and she is the first woman elected to the lead the amalgamated City of Toronto, since the 6 municipalities formed together. She immigrated to Canada with her parents at the age of 13 and has had a long and commendable career in public service. She served as trustee in the Toronto District School Board, a Metro councillor under the old Metro government system, and as a member of Parliament in the House of Commons. Following her departure from federal politics, she authored a book called My Journey in 2015, and she had joined the Metropolitan University as a distinguished visiting professor. We're very honored to have Mayor Chow with us today, and I know it's a very busy day because council's on, and I remember those days, so it's especially gratifying to be able to get out of there, and I guess that's a bit of a blessing for about 40 minutes. Mayor Cam Guthrie has been mayor of the City of Guelph since 2014. I was fortunate enough to meet with him last spring with our president, Richard Lyall, and he's a great forward-thinking mayor. And before that, he was a city councillor, and he also served as chair of the Ontario Big City Mayors Group, which has 29 mayors representing 70% of Ontario's population. Mayor Guthrie was a licensed insurance broker and an entrepreneur for 16 years prior to becoming the mayor of Guelph. And Mayor Natasha Salonen was elected mayor of Wilmot in October 2022. As mayor, she serves as a regional councillor. She has worked in politics in the federal and provincial governments since 2012, now municipal, so that's the hat trick. She has a BA in Human Sciences from Oxford University. She resides in Baden and recently illuminated the challenges faced by younger people in our province with respect to housing affordability. Her public discussions about her need to live at her family home due to housing affordability helped to demonstrate for many people the personal challenges faced by people across the province in terms of being able to afford their own home. So thank you to all three of you for joining us today. And our format is going to be fairly simple. We will ask the three mayors to individually comment on an opening question for about 5 minutes each. And then we'll have an open panel following that for about 15 minutes as well. So the opening question is, let's see, there we go. The opening panel is, our open question rather is, what are your municipality's top 3 priorities to address the housing crisis? So what are your municipality's top 3 priorities, probably out of 100, to address the housing crisis? And how we'll do this, we'll start with Mayor Chow, followed by Mayor Guthrie, and then Mayor Salonen. So Mayor Chow, if you could take us off.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll go straight into answering your excellent question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to attend your housing summit even though it's from on Zoom. 3 top priorities: speed, density, dollar, and land. That's 4 actually. I can't not mention that getting the land, finding the money to build, providing more density, and making it a lot faster. To break it down, we are now building housing takes a long time. What we're also doing is supporting ways to deal with housing that are being demolished, that the city is purchasing some of them in order to provide affordable rental for the existing residents so they won't be displaced. In terms of speed, we're trying to fast track our process, our planning and process, make it one-stop shop, and been working with various city staff, developers, with a team that are reporting back in November, which is in 4 or 5 weeks, with a host of things that we are doing. We have consolidated all our staff because right now they're under different departments when we're talking about speed. So that's, we consolidated into one department, one person in charge of providing the approval. We have, of course, looking at higher density, especially as of right, especially on Main Street and Transit Corridor. We are using city land to build more. So those are very quickly what we are doing. We're also providing money, which is very important because that's an incentive, right?
Yeah, and I believe council, they just passed an increase in the vacant home tax, which is going to be directed to affordable housing. I think you moved a motion on that, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It's important because we need, but that if you leave it for more than 2 years, now sometimes when you just finish constructing the place, it will take a bit of time for people to purchase it, but leaving it vacant for that period of time, you're going to pay more. Into 3%, we are looking at generating some funds. We're going to take the funds and put it into the acquisition fund, so that we're able to support building more affordable housing.
And also, I guess the city's moving forward with the really extensive housing action plan, right? Which is in the Planning and Housing Committee. So it's probably one of the most
60,000
anywhere.
Yep, it is. We have we're looking at 60,000 rental units, and we have the report that was in front of council, which we approved, is 40,000. There's a report coming in 3 weeks that is another 25,000 on top of it. but consolidating, because right now the city has 3 departments doing everything, doing different things. We're consolidating into one place, which is the Housing Secretariat, Create TO, Toronto Community Housing, now all talking together, working together to say that we are looking at delivering what the province of Ontario want us to do, which is 285,000 units of housing. But in terms of what we're doing ourselves, we are looking at creating 60,000 units of rental units by the city, using a lot of it using city land and federal land, hopefully, and provincial.
Working on that one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor Chow. And so I'll maybe move over to Mayor Guthrie if you want to take your 5 minutes and let us know what's happening in Guelph.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. And I would just say ditto to everything that Mayor Chow just said. Much of what she's leading about in Toronto is a lot of the similar things that Guelph and many other municipalities are trying to do. I think the first one is speed. And when I also say speed as well, that means a couple of things. I think that's staffing up our building and inspection departments to try to make sure that we can get things moving faster through the system. I would say that it also includes technology, making sure we're embracing technology to make things much easier for people, developers big and small, to be able to go through the process of some of the checks and balances of the regulatory framework that municipalities have. And then I would also say that we're also trying to, and I don't mean this in a weird way, but councils need to sort of get out of the way. And what I mean by that is there ways in which we could set up policies, and we're doing this, where we give more delegated authority to our planning staff to be able to get things done? Or we're changing things for where we're changing our zoning and our official plans to make things as of right in many different categories. So again, developers don't have to come to council. And that's what I mean by get out of the way. So the more things that we can create policies around, which we're doing, the more delegated authority that we can give to staff, then, these things can move faster through the system. And that's probably the first kind of, bullet point I would make around speed. The other thing that we're trying to do as well is really align our budgeting to unlocking infrastructure. Many cities, including Guelph, are having always issues about wanting to build more, but the capacity in the pipes is going to be a problem. So we have to be able to figure out how we align infrastructure to unlock housing. And of course, I'm sure all the mayors here would say that a lot of that funding should come from other levels of government to help us out. But we can only do what we can do, but we're trying to make sure we align our budgets to unlock a lot of the housing that is so dearly needed. And then the final thing I would just say, I guess, is one thing that we're really trying to move forward on is unlocking brownfield rehabilitation. A lot of our cities have these brownfield lands. They happen to be like right in the middle of many core areas of our city. So it's near a transit line or near amenities that people can immediately be a part of a community if it was just built up. And for me, I'm really concentrating on that because these are sitting on our municipal books as actually liability on our books. And if we can get them cleaned up, there's a win for everybody. There's a win because you get the environmental cleanup. Then there's a win that you get housing built. And for many of these many of these pieces of land, they are owned by municipalities, sometimes by default, because people have just left and then the municipalities left holding those lands. And so we have a lot more control over them so that we can try to make sure we get more affordable housing on some of those lands as well, because we control it a little bit more. So, those types of things with new buildings, of course, and housing and other options, then complete communities instead of these sort of, these brownfield deserts in the middle of many of our cities that could easily be full of life and people living there and enjoying those areas and cleaning up those areas. So those are three things: the speed, the get out of the way kind of part, and the infrastructure unlocking aligned to budgets and new development. And then brownfield cleanup is something that I'm really trying to get a hold of as well. A little bit more control on that, environmental cleanup, and more housing that can be done right away. So yeah, thanks for the 5 minutes. I appreciate it.
One thing I used to spend a lot of time down in Guelph in the early 2000s, Mayor Guthrie, and it's amazing the actual growth that you've seen in residential construction out there. How is the city dealing with that in terms of, issues like transit and everything else? Like, is there room to grow more, or is there, because you can literally see the densification there?
Yeah, so we are one of the fastest growing communities, not just in Ontario, but actually in Canada. And it's a struggle because as you look to build out housing, you can't forget about building community, and that includes transit and rec centers and parks and trails. So all the other growth related things that are important for a community are tied into the growth of housing. And so it is stuff that we're investing in as much as we possibly can. Of course, budget time's coming up for all of us soon. And so I'm sure there'll be some difficult choices there. But we are trying to invest in all of that to make sure that our city is not only great for the people that are here, but are going to be great for the people that are going to be coming here as well. And so a lot of it is infrastructure, the stuff that people don't see, the pipes in the ground and things like that. But at the end of the day, a community is also tied in with the things that people touch, feel, see amongst their community too, and that matters as well. So we're trying to make sure it's all balanced together.
And you have a lot of low density building, right? Like people, I get the sense that people from, say, places like Toronto look to Guelph to get the low density stuff that they probably couldn't acquire in the city of Toronto, and obviously that's having impact. Yes, there's a little bit of that slogan that's been used over the last couple of years called "Drive till you qualify." Which, the GTA area is maybe some struggling with housing. And so they start driving down the 401 and they hit Mississauga, and then they hit, Milton, and then they hit Guelph. And it's like, oh, I can afford a place here. And so they start to come here, quite a lot of them. I will say that the province did make some official plan changes to our plans in May of this year for our downtown core. To actually allow up to 23 stories with almost in the entirety of our downtown core. So that was a big change. And so from a high-rise point of view, you're going to start seeing a lot more density within our downtown core and some other pockets around the city. But those more low-rise or, semi-detached, yet some detached, yes, you still get a lot of that here in Guelph. We're trying to find a balance. But also trying to make sure that we create the opportunity for a lot of density, especially around transit-oriented stations and such like that. Thank you very much, Mayor Guthrie. Mayor Salonen, is just the same question to you. What are your municipality's top 3 priorities to address housing and sort of what's happening out there in Wilmot and your personal experience? It would be great if you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you again so much for having me today. Really honored to be on this panel. So in terms of Wilmot, a little bit different than Toronto and Guelph, that we are a rural municipality. So we're only about 22,000 people across roughly 6 different settlement areas, and then a lot of agriculture in between. But we are also part of the region of Waterloo, so right next to Kitchener, and Waterloo and Cambridge is just to go further afield to get larger properties and bigger homes, which is what we tend to have, our single detached homes. So when we're looking at priorities for our municipality, a big proponent of that is getting our housing supply, as everybody has mentioned. But part of that is through having encouraging secondary units in existing homes. Also, we're starting to see a lot of developers come in and purchase homes and put up 6-plexes or 4-plexes. And then also working with our developers who own our greenfield space in our regional official plan, and how do we get them to shovel ready and actually building homes. We have quite a few approvals that we now just need to see the houses actually coming. And some of that is also in brownfield. And I would definitely agree with Mayor Guthrie that our brownfield developments are kind of eyesores in a lot of our main towns. So how do we one, help with the environmental remediation, and then to see that turned into housing and really complete those communities. And a second point, I would be continuing to work with our federal and provincial counterparts. We rely a lot on infrastructure funding, especially as rural municipalities with lots of bridges that connect our communities and roadways, and of course, those pipes that are under the ground to bring all of our water and wastewater to our houses. So working with them on funding to ensure that when developers are ready to build, we have the wastewater capacity, we have those pipes already inaccessible, and also on the other side that we're staffed up on the municipal end and that we actually have staff in the building able to help push along and speed up all of these processes, as we are expecting a huge increase in growth over the next 30 years. And then thirdly, really, we're looking for creative solutions with stakeholders and destigmatizing housing myths is what I would say. In rural small towns, like I said, a lot of us are on single detached homes. And so once somebody sees a townhome proposed, there's a lot of NIMBYism that's experienced. And a lot of that is, you know, those people we don't want in this part of the community. And well, those people are frankly people's kids, includes most of my generation. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you saw that I can't afford a home in Wilmot Township right now. And we need to see a whole mix of housing so that people such as myself, but also we have a lot of seniors in rural Ontario, including in Wilmot, who want to downsize and they just have nowhere to downsize to stay in their community. So we really want to work with developers and organizations. We have a great local community called Links. They're a grassroots community who are actually taking a brownfield site. They're redeveloping our old mill into 31 affordable housing apartment units. And that's right in the heart of New Hamburg, which is one of our main communities. So being able to support non-for-profits who are doing great work and can bring housing affordability. And it's also a lot easier sometimes when it's outside groups versus governments trying to bring that in, that we don't have the land in rural municipalities. We're not like the city of Toronto who can build affordable housing on our lands. We just don't have extra land holdings. So how do we work with those groups? And I think also too, looking, there's a great model in one of our senior retirement communities, which is Morningside, and they're almost using, I would say, kind of a trailer park model in that you own the home, but you don't own the land. So we need to look at solutions. How do we remove land costs? Because that is certainly one of our biggest inhibitors on the affordability side of housing is the price of land out here. So looking at interesting solutions like that and hopefully bringing more affordable housing to our community.
Great. Thank you very much, Mayor Salonen. And now we moved our panel question, which is, you know, feel free to interact with each other. It's one of those questions where we could probably actually take the whole rest of the afternoon on this, but, you know, what do you feel other levels of government need to do more of to support municipalities as they address the housing crisis? And then maybe start with Mayor Chow again. I know you've been sort of front and center on this for a little while now. So, and you've been in Ottawa, you've been at Queen's Park. So maybe give us an enlighten us on some of that.
Okay, sure. Well, let me start with the provincial government. Provincial government, as I said, want us to build in 10 years 285,000 units of housing, is about 115% increase. While they're doing that, they just Bill 23 took away our opportunity to really have much say over where we could find the funding for infrastructure, which means that if we can't build the roads and the sewage and the parks and, you know, the holistic, you can build the housing, but if you don't have a nearby school or community center or a library, or, well, even making it worse, the sewage or the water, it's not going to work. So we are saying to them that the existing numbers of housing that we're building is going to cost us over 10 years because of Bill 23. It's going to cost us $2.3 billion. Now, that's not including the 110% increase of growth. You cannot have growth without having infrastructure. Just won't work. You can just one look at the garden, and you say, when is the thing's going to fall down? I'm exaggerating a bit, but it is. Like you see all these orange sign on it, marked up, and literally we're at $1.5 billion deficit. So so we're asking the province, as they promised, to quote, make us whole, or to find some ways to deal with infrastructure. If they want to take some of our highways and transfer costs, go for it. But the thing is, we can't grow unless we have that kind of infrastructure in place. And no one wants to move into a neighborhood that are not serviced well, because you're just creating neighborhood that's not healthy and not very livable. So we're asking the Premier Ford to deal with this big issue that I'm sure Cam and Natasha is also saying the same thing. Yep, nodding here. The other aspect of it is for a big city like transit, it's so connected with housing, because people like to go live where there's transit, because if the congestion is so high, it's just not very convenient. So if you look at the downtown area in Toronto, I was a city councillor for City Metro for 14 years, representing downtown Toronto. It's dense, and we dezoned the Kings, which is the entertainment district, and there were 99 projects that got done. It was fast way to do it, but we relied a lot on builders, developers, to help us build parks, childcare centers, library down by the waterfront, all of those things, so that at least the neighborhood is livable, right? So that piece is really important, that we are asking the province to work with us so that there is a permanent, long-term, sustainable financial plan that can sustain the city of Toronto. If not, we won't grow well. And so that's what we're negotiating. And nowhere else in this country, in the world, that you have a metropolis, a big city, that the public transit relied only on property taxes. So what does that have to do with building housing? Well, a whole lot, because we can't manage the housing if we don't have the infrastructure, including transit. So that's the second piece. The third piece is that we have noticed that in terms of the building, we're looking at putting in, between land and development charges, exemptions, and all of those things, we're committing about $8 billion in the next 10 years to build and build and build some more. The provincial has only put in $1 billion, and the federal government is $2.3 billion. So we're asking them to provide land, provide financial support so we could accelerate, because we have to hire more planners, for example, engineers. If not, it would just get stuck, right? And the technology that Mayor Gundry, Cam, if I may, suggested, some municipalities is amazing, fast, transparent planning system. We're quite jealous, because the more transparent it is, the more accountable the city government can be. Because when you put in an application, you need to know how long it's going to take, right? You want to see each step of the way. You want to see where things are at. So we're seeking funds from both the provincial and the federal government to do that. In terms of the federal government, they have announced a lot of dollars. It hasn't flown out yet. I'm glad they did the GST. It's been promised for many years that would help build rental. But what about this housing accelerator fund? It's supposed to accelerate. Let's see it. Let's accelerate the approval and get the funds onto, the municipality that's doing the work. So folks, help us out, okay? Let's make it happen. So those are some of the things that the federal and the provincial government can assist. I can go on for another half an hour, but you don't need.
Oh, no, I know. Thank you, Mayor Chair. Mayor Guthrie?
Well, thank you. I just love what Olivia is saying. I feel like giving my time over to her just to so she can keep going. But so again, ditto to much of what Olivia just said, and so I'll add on top of that, maybe some icing on the cake here. You know, one of the things I think the provincial government could do is make whatever changes they're really looking at making, and then please leave us alone. There has been so many changes that have come from the provincial government that it is bogging down our staff from being focused on planning approvals for actual developments and housing to instead focus all of their time on sending in consultation after consultation after consultation. And so I'm not suggesting that maybe more doesn't need to be done. I'm saying, okay, whatever it is, do it. And please let us amend our processes and regulations here to align with what they want to do, but then give us some breathing room, because it's just been constant changes, and that bogs the entire system down. So I would say that would be something that they should do. I have to just say, though, a little bit more of the ditto here from Olivia, but I just found out last night Guelph is looking at, you know, the proportions are obviously different than Toronto, but we're looking at a $227 million shortfall in our infrastructure over the next 10 years in Guelph. That's $27 million a year, and it's probably between a 7 to 8% tax increase every year to make up the shortfall from the legislative changes. And look, I'm a get along guy. I love getting along with everybody, but you know, it's pretty terrible that municipalities have been asking the provincial government to make us whole, and they promised to make us whole almost a year ago, and we still don't have an answer. None of us have an answer, and we're right in the middle of doing our budgets right now. Most municipalities are getting ready to do their budgets. And every single one of us has consistently told them, our budgets are coming up. Our budgets are coming up. Please, how are you making us whole? You promised you would. How's it going to happen? And none of us have answers. And to leave it to the last minute like this is just, it causes a lot of friction in the relationship side when we don't want any friction, because we all need to be focused on building homes. We all agree with that. So I think if the province could settle themselves down a little bit on all these constant changes, if the province could be clear with municipalities on how they're going to make us whole, it gives everyone that certainty. And I think that's a key word to take away. Municipalities are looking for certainty so they can get going on implementing after that. From the federal level, I would just say that, you know, Olivia, along with the big city mayors through FCM, are doing like amazing work with the, you know, the new deal that they're looking for when it comes to revenue growth compared to population growth and other revenue type of levers that municipalities need. And that's not just for the big cities across Canada, that's for everybody. And so FCM, I think, is doing a fantastic job. And then leaders like Olivia and the other ones are bringing that up all the time. And I will say just thank you, because even though I don't sit on the Canada-wide big city mayors, it's going to help me, and it's going to help Wilmot, and it's going to help all other municipalities across the country if the levels of government start treating municipalities with the respect and the true order of government that we are and deserve that respect, to make sure that we're getting new revenue tools that climb with the economy, climb with population growth, and that will really help us as well. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Mayor Guthrie. Mayor Salonen?
Well, I mean, I most certainly echo everything that Mayor Chow and Mayor Guthrie have already said. Cam, though, I mean, did you not hear about the BFF announcement at AMO? That funding source to make us whole? But actually, on that funding source, as a rural municipality with no housing targets, we do not benefit from that pot. I think about 10% they're putting aside for rural Ontario. By the time all of us get a little bit of that, that's not even a position filled in my department to help accelerate housing approvals. So really hitting home on the province that we need to have whatever this wholeness is, we need to know what that revenue source is and see that come through. I would also completely echo and agree with that the province, whatever they're going to do, please just do it and then move on so that we can do our jobs. Our region is one of the regions that was brought in expecting a review and a facilitator. That's now been pushed off to committee, and it's been really a nightmare because planning, we've been told, is being downloaded to our lower tier, which is great, with no end site or specific date on when that's happening. So it's just created friction between our regional planning departments, our local planning, and confusion, frankly, for our developers on where do they go, what steps and hurdles do they need to go through. So if we could just get a solid answer on what that is and move on, that would be fantastic. Federally, I love the announcement on the Housing Accelerator Fund. I would love to see that money distributed just beyond London, since the City of London did get their confirmation. I don't know if the money's flowing there yet, but I know we certainly have some applications in Wilmot, and I'm sure elsewhere, including Toronto, Guelph, and everywhere else, is waiting to hear on that funding and see what got approved, and that will really help us, again, with staffing up and with being able to do some of our objectives locally. So really, that would be fantastic from the federal government. I think also we need to look at how can we de-incentivize? I mean, we have an entire real estate industry that goes far and wide for marketing great investment opportunities for homes, which I totally get. And I get that it's commission-based. If I were a realtor, I'd be doing the same thing. But it is adding up when everybody has their own incentives and commissions along the way. That adds up to housing affordability not really working out. So can we look at de-incentivizing perhaps the investment side, where you do see houses that sit empty for people's investment's sake, or at least incentivize them to be renting it out? I'm not against investing in real estate, but I know there's a lot of conflicting interests, especially when we look federally, that most of the House does invest in real estate. So when they're making decisions on housing affordability, they have a personal vested interest financially. So I think certainly looking at some of those opportunities as well. And I mean, you already heard the other very articulate answers from Cam and Olivia, which I completely agree with. And I think we just need to continue pushing the province and the feds on really partnering and just recognizing that we're the ones who are going to get the housing built. So if they can remove their barriers and help with the financing, then we can actually do something and build more houses.
And I think that just quickly that Mayor Chow, that's what I guess City Council focused on with the vacant homes tax, is to make sure these houses go on the market for rent so that people can actually live in them, right? That's a good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for participating. That was it was a wonderful panel. You know, I worked in federal and provincial and municipal, and for many years, and I can tell you that municipal is the most challenging, and I'm sure everybody would agree. I know Mayor Chow also worked federally as well. Municipal is the most challenging. It's the stuff that people see when they walk out the door. You know, if the traffic light isn't working or the street light isn't on and there's a pothole. And so you have those sort of more local and small issues. And then you have these big issues that with housing, you know, and I think, you know, all three mayors sort of alluded to the whole notion of stable funding. And yeah, you know, municipalities need some form of stable funding so that it's predictable. And, you know, we've had some discussions where people have suggested that we could possibly see something like a, you know, the way the Canada Health transfer works is to have something like that with respect to infrastructure, so that municipalities know what's coming down the pike. They know how much they're going to be getting, and they know what they need to do. But again, we're very fortunate to have had the three of you here today. And we've got about 3 minutes. If anybody wants to have a quick sign-off comment, maybe do a minute each if you want to have something quick to say. Mayor Chow?
Yes, please. I think given there are 395 participants on, all builders, developers, you can get the ears of both the provincial and the federal government. Your mayors, the mayors across Ontario are seeking your help. we need you to say that we can do this together. We have a big challenge. We've done it before. The city of Toronto at the turn of the century welcomed over, 50,000 Irish immigrants landed on the shore of the city of York at the time. We dealt with healthcare, clean water, housing, it wasn't perfect, but look at Toronto, right? We can do this, but we need to come together and work together. And yes, we can put the reduced barriers. I saw quite a few questions about NIMBYism. Well, the best way to do NIMBYism is to provide as of right zoning. Okay, if you want to do 4-story, go for it, or 4 units, no problem. You don't have to do combative adjustment. You don't have to do rezoning. But in order for us to do all that, we need your help, because a livable city is not just building, it's building things around it that makes the people that move in very happy. I've seen through the years, because I've been around for a long time and a lot of experiences, that developments that consider green space, environmental, transit, libraries, gathering place, it's so much. Density is no problem, because people get to know each other. They have a sense of belonging, right? In order to do that, it's not just about building that building, it's all those social infrastructure also. So if you can reach out to whether it's foundations, pension plans, capitals, dollars, federal, provincial government, give us a hand. And so that we're not always saying, I'm not taking all my energy going to different levels of government saying, please give us some financial support. We would love to spend more time on having good build form to say to homeowners, hey, one-stop shop. We have this form for you. This, you don't even need to go and get all these people. If you want to build here, this is one of the 5 models, 8 models, just go for it. Then you don't have to do site plan and all of those things, just get on with it. That we can do a lot of creative stuff if we have some emotional and financial energy push to be able to do so. So that's thank you for giving me the opportunity to say
as
that.
they say in the radio, I'm out of time today, so I want them to invite me back next year. So I just want to say thank you to Mayor Chow, thank you to Mayor Guthrie, thank you to Mayor Salonen. It was a great panel. We really appreciated your insights, and I'm going to pass back to Corinne now, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and my goodness, fantastic panel with the mayors. Our next session, Outstanding Reforms Needed to Spur Supply, will be starting at 1:55, so don't stray too far from your computer. Looks like we have 4 minutes, so it's just enough time to sprint, get some coffee, get some water, and we'll meet you back here at 1:55. Welcome back once again, and if you're joining us for the first time today, we're about to kick off our next session, Outstanding Reforms Needed to Spur Supply. Marlon Bray from Altus is here today, and he's going to provide an overview of the major challenges impeding the supply of housing, including the scale of the challenge we face, where we stand today, and potential solutions that could help solve the housing crisis. Now, before I hand you over, let me tell you just a little bit about Marlon. Marlon is the head of Altus Group's Ontario Pre-Construction and Contract Administration Services as part of the cost and project management team. With over 25 years of experience specializing in budgeting, value optimization, and providing visibility on risk through the entire life cycle from early due diligence through to completion, Marlon oversees a team that leads the way with cutting-edge estimating technology and data analytics, bringing a greater level of transparency and added value to all projects that he's involved with. With that, Marlon, I am going to give you the virtual mic.
Thank you very much. The more times I hear that introduction, the more times I realize how boring my job actually is. Now let's press share. Right, we should be up and running. So I tend to take an eclectic way of doing presentations. I will apologize today. I have a sinus infection, hence the fact we're wearing a golf shirt because I may pass out in a suit. But that aside, I tend to take an eclectic view on how I present information, and it's meant tongue-in-cheek. So right now I'm using what is the 7 deadly sins, or basically, as we're going to call this one, why are there not enough homes? So the 7 deadly sins everyone's aware of. The picture's actually from a famous painting that was allegedly by someone who was famous, but apparently it was their follower. It gets complex. Anyway, you'll get the gist as we move in. So if you look at the scale of the problem, and the way I like to look at the scale of the challenge we face is to put it in numbers. And right now, if you were to build 5.5 to 6 million homes over the next 10 years, which is what CMHC is trying to do, then this optimistically would cost about $3.3 to $3.8 trillion. I know CMHC put out a number of $1 trillion the other day that basically doesn't buy you diddly squat. This number could be as high as 5 trillion. It could be as low as 3.3 trillion. Taking into account in the GTA, trying to build an apartment these days is between 700 and 900 grand each. You look at the national debt of Canada, it's $2 trillion right now. You look at our annual tax revenue, federal level, it's 441 billion. So if you look at this in developer way of looking at it, it takes them 8 years at full revenue for them to try and solve the problem. We got our adding carbon neutral. So realistically, we have a much larger challenge. So this challenge is going to have to be a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. The public sector can't solve this on their own. They just simply don't have the cash. So when I look at rating for the current reforms, remembering it's tongue-in-cheek, so basically I went for some pictures. Basically, the current reforms that have been done nationwide, never mind in Ontario, I'd say tepid to warm at best. I think there was some points made in the mayor's comments earlier. It's basically been haphazard, reactionary, lacks a coordinated, complete national strategy that solves the issues. It's small bites here and there. There's a lot of risks of unintended consequences with some of the stuff that's been thrown out there. Reports, recommendations have been provided. They've been cherry-picked and used. It's almost like the politicians are testing the water, trying to see what the public reaction is and going, wow, that's a great plan. Unfortunately, that's not going to work. So each municipality seems to be someone on their own. And I think Mayor Guthrie had a good point before. Can someone just come up with a plan and make it happen and stop changing it? So we need a big plan, big reforms, and we need to do them now and get them done. Because right now we're wasting everybody's time. And quite frankly, housing crisis is not going to get solved where we are today or anything that's been proposed. We're nibbling at the edges. Again, tongue-in-cheek before I get really into it. Basically, there's this assumption that developers, home buyers, you know what, they're having a hell of a time. Bang head here is the way I like to look at it. In essence, every time you wake up, you stare in disbelief at the latest announcements, and then the bang head here, smash your head repeatedly to reduce stress, grab a drink of scotch, then sit in the corner and rock yourself in a dark room to try and understand what the hell people are up to. The whole system's still stacked against developers. It's stacked against home buyers. It's stacked against people trying to rent units. It's just utterly failing to deal with the crisis, and it's not being taken in a serious manner, no matter what everybody says, because if it was, we would be dealing properly with social housing as affordable housing, where a lot of the focus has been around the market side of things. And I reckon on the social housing, affordable housing, every time 50 units are announced or 100 units are announced, celebrated with this huge pageantry, the problem's massive. 95,000 units short in Toronto. That's a 15-year waiting list. That's all over the country. So we have to look at this, that we need tens of thousands of social housing. We need hundreds of thousands of market units, 3,000 here, 4,000 there. It's not actually making a difference. We're still going backwards. The other point before I move into the presentation is, could everyone in government please actually try to understand how development works? Listening to some of the announcements, reading some of the articles that get published, reading some of the solutions that come up, it's very clear that there's a lot of people that have no concept how the private sector works in terms of development or our home building works. Big reform would be, how about an education program? So everyone knows what the 7 deadly sins are. I'm going to trundle through them in a random order. And the reason I use this is to try and make it a little bit more light, because if I just jumped up here and showed you 30 minutes of charts, everyone would fall asleep. First, greed, designing what you need. This is a chart I like to use when I'm explaining the market, and it's to scale a demonstration of how the current housing market works, either rental or condominium. In essence, the developer's profit is the smallest jar, but often the person that's lambasted for making a profit. Land comes out second, and then fees and government charges make the most. I think that's going to be a common topic during the day. And if you look across the country, part of what I meant about there's no common strategy is different cities are approaching stuff differently for no apparent reason whatsoever. So if you look at high-rise rental, in Montreal, it's highly supported, it's highly promoted. 70% of all starts in Montreal are rental. Vancouver, kind of supported, could do a little better. Basically 30-40% of starts. City of Toronto, lucky if we hit 17%. Why? It's treated the same as a condo. That defies any form of logic. So there's 2 points. One, rental is critical to solving the housing crisis. Two, you can't ignore condos. So we should look at those too. So as we wander around, take a look at condos, this is how it looks in terms of if I sell a condo unit for $1 million, this is where the purchaser's money goes. The developer pulls about 8 to 11%. Don't forget, that's before they pay tax. That's before all of the other aspects go into a running a company are pulled out of that. And you have to remember that's over 10 years. So I do understand that people are offended that anyone could ever make profit in any business, but it's part of life. And if you want to grab hold of $2 or $3 trillion, you better have something there to pull some. Okay, so we're back up and running again.
Yes, you look good.
Perfect. So I'll speed up because now I got even less time. Anyway, so what I was talking about, basically the developer pulls 8 to 11% profit. Most of the money of the last number of years has been going into the government charge section, which in Toronto is about 22 to 24%. Circle back to 2016, it was 14 to 18%. If you pull this out to the whole of Ontario, most municipalities are actually closer to the 17%. This is a made in Toronto jacked up rate. The other challenge is that profit doesn't actually move as you move out of Toronto. That profit stays the same, but the cost and the other aspects actually increase in percentage value. And the challenge we're starting to see, especially in Toronto now, is construction costs are actually less than half of the total cost of a unit, which defies any logic. If I turn this into low rise, basically the land drops to a 10 to 15%, construction goes up, there's a service and grading component, and profit's even worse than this. These days, it's barely worth building low-rise units in the current market. Throw over to rental. Rental, in essence, is very similar. This is pre-GST. I'll deal with that in a second. But basically, those government charges do come down slightly with the changes that happened in Bill 23. The thing to focus on is if you looked at developer profit or stabilization, they were in the hole 5 to 6% on a good day. At stabilized period, this number that can actually be much larger, which is why outside of the CMHC Select program, we have very little rental under construction. The other thing to note is the land value tends to drop rapidly versus a condo. A lot of purposeful rental doesn't go on purchased land. It tends to go on intensification. So what did GST do? So this is a simple table. Basically, this is a 500-unit theoretical twin tower building in Mississauga. We're using a 30-year discounted cash flow. So this is actually fully cash flowed out for the life of the building. So GST helps, but it wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a silver bullet, and it's still a bit of a problem. So basically, at a stabilized period, the project before the GST rebate was worth negative $49 million on the books at the day of stabilization. That is basically your income kind of covers off your loan in very simplistic terms. And after 10 years, you made a whopping profit of $6 million after investing a hell of a lot of money, aka no one in the right mind would build this. The 100% HST rebate, if we look at it like that, in essence means that this stabilized period, we're probably looking at only about $26 million loss. But over the 10-year period, we got a $39 million holding profit. So it looks a little bit better. So it's going to move the market to a degree, just not enough. I'll talk about some other levers we can move in a moment. But I just wanted to make people aware that, yes, this announcement's great. It's just not going all the way to cause a deluge of new projects, which is what we need. Gluttony, overconsumption. Going back again onto the municipal side, I have a real problem with DCs in general and the way they're calculated and the way they're increased. So if you look in the newspapers, at the last check, the GTA municipalities were selling about $6 billion in DC and Parkland in lieu in reserve. So they're already in reserve, but then the numbers just keep getting increased, including the latest large increases. So if you look over a 10-year period, basically they've gone up 6 times. They've gone up $70,000 a suite. The other thing that drives me absolutely crazy is everyone's saying we want to build sustainable buildings. But if you look at the dotted line at the bottom, this is basically how much the rebate has changed to go to TGS Tier 2. How can that not be indexed to the DC itself? It makes no sense. So when we look at housing being unaffordable, part of the puzzle, or a significant part of the puzzle, is the cities having to use housing as a revenue source. And that means that's where the money goes, because the impact on voters is zero or close to zero. People who are buying a new home or a new unit tend not to be the people voting. The other thing that drives me crazy about this side of things is the madness. It just keeps coming. This goes back to bang your head against the wall. September 28th, Metro Vancouver Regional Authority announced that they are going to increase their DCs by $11,000 to $15,000 per apartment. So everyone knows we're in a housing crisis, but we're still increasing them. Single-family homes, $25,000. Why? Why has that not been looked at? Then September 26th, our own provincial government got in on this with a station contribution fee. Now, they did add the caveat that basically to charge that fee, you have to show the developers benefited in some way in a reduction of costs, such as I reduced parking. So great. I'm going to give you less parking. You save $5 million. Now you can build your building. But hey, I'm just going to charge you in the other hand so I can build a train station. This approach to infrastructure is borderline farcical. Now, what can we do with rental? And you could apply this to condo as well to a degree. What else changes can we make? Well, if I did a 100% DC rebate or deferral, now all of a sudden that development profit of stabilization has gone to 3.5 million after a 10-year holding period at 79 million. I'd say this project looks a hell of a lot better on paper and is more likely to cause that deluge. Now, if I did a property tax deferral, it's a similar level of returns. But if I put these two together, now create an environment where we can build a lot of rental. Now, this doesn't mean that the profit has to be the 160 million. That's when we can start looking at how do we do options for affordable rent? How do we do options that can benefit people? How do we approach the social housing side of things? And instead of using the stick, we use a carrot, which I know is a novel idea in politics, but sometimes it works. Paul's going to talk about this later, I believe, but in effect, municipalities, I agree with what was said earlier, they get the short straw. So on infrastructure, basically, the feds take all the money and they don't give it back. The other challenge to this is the money that gets taken and not given back is blown on God knows what. It comes from housing, it should be sent back for housing, it should only be used for infrastructure, and the money should be redistributed down to municipalities to allow them to deal with DCs in a proper and reasonable and fair way. Also, I'm really tired of hearing municipalities cry about funding sources and whatnot. Can we just fix this once and for all? If I was in a room with some of the people, I'd actually have a fear of drowning because there's so many tears half the time. And I'm tired of the conversation getting ruined by coming back to the same discussion point. It needs dealing with. This one's an odd way of looking at it, I know, but, and I'll deal with forms later. Sustainability presents a massive risk to home building. I know everyone's going to go, well, we've got a climate problem. Yeah, we have a climate problem, but if we don't roll out sustainability in a proper way, we're going to come up with a bunch of reforms that allow us to accelerate housing, and then we're going to kill it. So as an example, this is an RBC study, and the percentages are a bit weird. You need to read the report. In essence, if you look at the global heat pump capacity, we have to increase that by 3 times in order to keep up with the demand with where we're heading. So everyone's going heat pumps, great. A heat pump has increased in price many times more than a fan coil. Without getting into details, that's going to carry on getting worse. CLT, love the stuff. What's our manufacturing capacity? It's a challenge. It needs to be thought about in the process. So one way I look at fees as a reform is a simplification, basically a single charge. I know it's supposed to be an, but I like simple. Take the money in fairly. Pull it up fairly, take it from the feds fairly, collect it all up into one place, and then allow that funding to come back down via the provinces. And municipalities apply once a year. They show what they need, when they need it, what the priorities are, and that money's handed back down. Not 50,000 different charges, not I'm going to pay an extra $15 if I want this piece of paper. One single charge for housing. That's it, province-wide. And then the money gets distributed where it's needed. That doesn't need to be size of city. That could be need when you need it. It creates a level playing field. I don't know if you could do this, but in my world, I like simple. Next. Oh, sorry. Pride. So there's 2 different ways of looking at pride. There's hubris, which everyone's aware of. And the one I like to do when I'm dealing with politics is hybris. Hybris, is called the extreme or excessive pride, dangerous overconfidence, often in a combination with arrogance. So where do we see evidence of that? Politicians. And again, here I'm mainly looking at poking fun at provincial and federal parties, but there's a couple of cartoons I think tell a story. First one basically says, hey, look, interest rates been increasing have really cooled the housing market. And it's a homeless person in a box reducing the price from 1.5 million to 1.4 million. Housing promises. There we go. All four parties make promises they can't meet and they can't reach, and they still leave housing out of reach. To be very, very clear, I have no political affiliations. I dislike them all, if that makes it easier. And then cash cow. Housing isn't a cash cow. Stop it. The other problem we have is, and this is an example, why do we keep trying to find solutions and then find the problem afterwards? Angular planes, I know it's been dealt with. Take a look around Europe, Barcelona, Berlin, Paris, Rome. There's not many angular planes. Why? We don't need them. Then look at New York. Again, reform. Solve the problems you have. Stop looking for new problems you don't have and avoid mission creep in general. We don't have to reinvent the wheel to solve problems. Bank of Canada. I'd say this is a good definition of hybrids. Basically killed the home market entirely. Is it good, bad? I don't know. But this is a whole lot of hybrids with not a lot of thought with where we're heading. Interest rates are going to slow construction of housing down to a snail's pace. And you can see where this impact has been on the developer side, the home buyer side. Condo sales this year, GTA, August, lowest ever. Sales down 49% from last year. It's going to stay bad. Other than a couple of projects that have done well, these numbers would have been even more horrific. Let's go out to the Greater Golden Horseshoe. This was doing fantastic. Sales down 71%. Sales are grinding to a halt. Offices, no one's in them, so everyone keeps saying, let's convert them. This is going to solve the problem. Without going through all of these numbers, this is something our economists did. If you look at all of the 197 million square foot of office in the GTA, you look at the Class B and C and go, what can I convert easily? It's about 16 to 17,000 units. Rounding error. What do we need to do? Stop replacing Class C offices. We don't need them. Let's replace them with residential. Class B, why do we need it? Envy. This is an odd way of doing envy. So this is a bit more of a skewed perception, might be the best way rather than envy. NIMBYs, they got mentioned before. Everyone's probably heard this line before. Basically, the way I look at NIMBYs is they're like zombies. They wander around aimlessly attacking things for no apparent reason whatsoever. You finally put them down, they get up and attack something else, and they have no limit on how far they will go to be offended by a project. You know the funny thing about NIMBYs? They hate social housing. I grew up in social housing, you know, I live next to me. California today announced a new way of dealing with homeless. They're calling it Yes in God's Backyard. Religious institutions, non-profit colleges will be allowed to turn every parking lot into low-income housing. They're going to remove all of the planning blocks and reviews in the way and let them just build. Not a bad idea, as an idea of reform, but NIMBYs need to get them out of the way. I get the right with as of right zoning. They're too influential. Punish the many. So I have two definitions up here. I have stupid and I have self-deception. Stupid's fairly obvious. Self-defection, the action or practice in allowing oneself to believe that false and invalidated feelings situations are true. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Stop writing reports that tell you what you want to hear. Land prices are not going to come down to accommodate inclusionary zoning. It's not going to happen. 2020, Montreal's solution to everything. No builders built any social housing. All they do is hand over a check. Do you know how many social houses have been built by this great 2020? Zero. Doesn't work. Politics, always the needs of the few. On this, I'm not going to go through the numbers. I'm going to give an example. But basically, if you look at politics, I used the mayoral race here. But if you were to look at the provincial and federal races, they're fairly similar numbers. Basically, if you look at a mayor, they represent 14% of eligible voters. The problem with that is then they pander to the loudest people in the room. The same with councillors. They tend to be the people envy a lot. If you look at it's 18% for the province, it's about 20% for the feds. That's who they represent. It's a problem. This was tossed out there, use it or lose it. There's a lot of unintended consequences. I'd say I'd really watch this approach. I would argue there's some bad developers out there. There's not many of them, but this could have very bad unintended consequences on the market. Short-term rental, sure, get rid of Airbnb. I don't really care about them at all. 20,000 units in the GTA, that's half a year's supply, basically, of what we're looking up to pick up. Yeah. Again, watch out for unintended consequences. Speed shit up, basically where I am, apologies for the language. Calgary runs at 140 miles an hour. Toronto run is basically a snail. You crawl on the branch, you give up, throw yourself off the branch, don't build. This was a study we did for the Canadian Home Builders Association. Basically, Toronto is the worst place to do business in North America in terms of approval times, and it got worse. Calgary's up here, does great. Look in the GTA version that we did for build. Milton, where I live, best place to do business. Everyone can build here. I don't think there's many NIMBYs because I've been living in construction for 20 years. I don't really care. Building permits. This is one of Richard's famous jokes he likes to make. In essence, getting a building permit in Canada, in basically the OECD countries, yeah, we're second worst. Only place worse than us in the Slovak Republic. Not sure how they got there, but apparently they're worse than Canada. So doing business in Canada is bad. Why? Approvals. Let's use Toronto as an example. World's biggest fatberg. Anyone doesn't know what a fatberg is? Basically, everyone puts stuff into the drain they're not supposed to. That all blocks up. This is a 450-ton one, and then nothing moves. This is a great example of the planning system. Every single thing is thrown at it. Hundreds of reports, report after report, review after review, redundant exercise after redundant exercise. How do we fix that? Simple. Basically, stop reinventing the wheel city by city and do a Ontario level approving system and an Ontario code. Sustainability should not be done city by city. It should be done on a provincial level tied into federal goals. Simplify the whole process. Get rid of NIMBYs. Third-party reports. Let's start streamlining them. Have a series of consultants under RFPs that can do third-party engineering reviews. Why keep hiring staff when these people exist in companies? Let's just get this done. Basically, we're all in it together. It needs to be looked at provincial level. Construction schedules. So the other challenge we are facing right now on the construction side is it takes 25 to 30% longer to build than it did before. This is mainly a high-rise problem. So not only do we need to build more, but we're going slower. Why? Lack of skilled labor. The former labor minister, who was doing a great job, basically sees this as the biggest economic challenge. It's a huge challenge. There's some numbers here from Buildforce. We don't have enough qualified site people. We've got 2 years where we're going to slow down in Ontario, and then we're in trouble. This needs fixing. It's the biggest threat from the developer contractor side to the cost. We also have problems with people offsite. I won't do my usual joke as we're struggling on time. I always get asked, what's the maximum capacity to build in Toronto? And again, I know I'm focusing on Toronto, not the whole of Ontario, but if I put every single town on here, we'd be here for a month and a half, and I'd probably lose the internet again. So this is a chart I threw together for someone the other day. This is a back of a cigarette packet. Basically, you go back to the, 20 years ago, the maximum capacity we could build was around 15,000 units a year between rental and condo in terms of high-rise. I'll explain why high-rise is where my focus is right now. We had an influx of labor that shifted up. Right now, we sit somewhere in the 22 to 24,000 range of our capacity. That's not enough when we've got to double up. The problem is all of these sources of bringing in labor are kind of been tapped out. So we need new reforms. This is being worked on, but it takes time. We've got to bring people in from college. We've got to tell kids this is the right place to go. We've got to improve our immigration system, which I think is being changed from the absolute farce it was previously. We need to recognize that skilled trades are essential. We also need to recognize that developers, construction managers, architects, municipalities, they all need staff that are qualified and skilled as well, or the whole system breaks down. The biggest single threat to me is this area. The other challenge, and why I keep going on about high rise, this little blob here is the ratio of high rise versus low rise in terms of starts. And if you went back to 1997, before I moved here, I came here in 2001, 10% of all housing was high rise. Last 2 years, we averaged 56% of all housing in Ontario being high rise. If you look up to August today, we're at about 65%. The future's high rise. There's only so much land for low rise. We're going to get pushed in. This is going to exacerbate the labor challenge. It's going to exacerbate the supply chain challenge. This is going to be a major issue. The other thing is these homes take 4 years to build. It's not like a low rise where we can be in and out in a year. These can be 4 or 5 year endeavors. So even when starts peak up, well, it's going to be a lag to completions. The whole process needs to be speeded up. There needs to be solutions and innovations that solve this. A reform idea I had is social and affordable housing, to me, speed. It's as urgent as it gets, and it has the greatest urgency. What if the federal and provincial government did an RFP? They could use Infrastructure Ontario, the infrastructure bank, and said, over the next 20 years, I'm going to build 200 to 300,000 affordable housing units. Municipalities chip in by waiving DCs and property tax, assuming the reforms I suggested earlier aren't done. All 3 levels of government chip in land. We can then look at really cool solutions like modularization to quickly construct the most critically needed housing in the most critical locations, especially social and affordable housing. And this then guarantees us production for modularization, which is the thing holding modularization back for the last 40 years, is this guaranteed on production volumes. If you have a guarantee, you can build a factory, you can invest. If you want to build an F-150 truck, if we only built 5 of them, it'd be a $500,000 truck. You can get one for less than 100 grand because it's the biggest selling truck in North America, no different than houses. Tax, land, so forth, sure, charge to the developer if they forward sell it, but defer it at the beginning. Bad slide to end on, I suppose. It's a picture from me in a hotel. I'm not reading it out. I'm already in trouble with my communications guys, and it's a little inappropriate. Basically, to finish on, the way I look at RAF is the public have finally realized where the problems are, where the gatekeepers are, and the feds are bearing the brunt of the housing crisis. Eventually, people will figure out that the province is in this and the municipality is in this. Politicians, if they're driven by re-election, better get a move on housing, because eventually everyone's going to figure out who did it and what the problem is, and how to solve it is just get them out of the way. Legal disclaimer, I won't go through it. Basically, I work for Altus when I'm in public. I don't work for Altus. There's a bunch of stats in here. Altus doesn't know if they're correct, and if you use them, it's your own fault. And if you go bankrupt, don't blame me. The end, and I apologize for the power loss.
Awesome.
I don't think I could have spoke much quicker, actually, to make up.
You just completely nailed that. And I think you might have a fan club too. If you check in the chat there's a whole lot of people who declare that this presentation needs to be seen by the world. So thank you so much.
No problem.
And you wrapped up right on time. So I'm going to thank you very much. And I'm going to let everyone know the next session, will Feds answer the call? Infrastructure investment lags amidst highly taxed housing construction will begin at 2:30. So again, you have a couple of minutes for a quick break. And then we will meet back here and we'll get started.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right, welcome back. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Smetanin. Paul Smetanin. Paul is the president and CEO of CANCEA, an analytics firm that has more than 400 clients and is home to Canada's largest economic analysis platform. As a thought leader in economic analysis, Paul has led over 180 studies covering topics such as housing, finance, infrastructure, and government policy. With that, I will hand you over to Paul. Have we got him here? I'll bring him up.
Yes, I'm here.
There you are. Perfect.
Thank you. Well, thanks for everyone for your time this afternoon. We're going to talk a little bit about the taxation of housing in Ontario and the role of the federal government in the funding of infrastructure and the implications for the taxation of housing in Ontario. It supports a lot of what Marlon has said. And so let's just step straight into it. Okay, so a lot of the issues about housing stock have been emerging over the last 4 decades. As you can see from this graph here, that unaffordability of homes has grown substantially in the last 2 decades by about 58%. But much of the problem has to do with the availability of new homes. While everyone has a different explanation for the housing crisis, there's a number of different factors involved. We've identified about 32. But when you really boil it all down, primarily it's the supply of housing that seems to be the primary culprit. In terms of we need immigration, and unfortunately this country is not very good at economics or producing things. It's very much a consumer-driven country now. It's been importing people ultimately to bolster up consumerism. It's starting to sort of turn to the fact that we need skilled trades, we need skilled labor and things of that nature. But, this just gives you an idea of if we stopped immigration, what would happen? Well, we'd look like Japan in 30 years' time or 25 years' time. And there would be a complete collapse in our labor force markets. And so, in terms of increasing immigration, and I haven't even sort of brought in the problem with government debt, in order to be able to get debt per capita down, and because the country really isn't sort of growing with the basis of productivity, it's ultimately about importing people. And essentially, without importing people, the country would be in quite a lot of trouble. In terms of the ability of Ontario to be able to build homes, as you can see by this graph here, in the 70s, it was quite often that per year, we could build 80,000 homes. And in fact, the highest sort of number of homes built, I believe, is in 1974. Yet, when you have a look at closer to today, our ability to build new homes has been decreasing. So while the population has grown by 68% since the 1970s, the number of annual housing new completions has actually dropped by 23%. And again, herein lies part of the problem. And when we say supply is necessary, you're not just looking at, well, let's build homes that just meets the demand for homes. It's very much like the rental market is you need an oversupply of homes so that you provide that flexibility in order for people to be able to have mobility and the mobility of the labor force and things that actually make an economy work. And part of the housing crisis has created immobility across many of our societies. And that's actually degrading the ability of the country to actually produce and to create economic prosperity. So it's a vicious cycle that is linked. And then on top of that, we live in a country that doesn't really believe investing in infrastructure or having an organized plan around infrastructure. Public infrastructure investment funding required to support growth is 30% below what it should be. And it's likely to get worse as the government spending hasn't been strategic and has built up a significant debt without long-term benefits of that spending. When debt levels are a problem, infrastructure is the first to go. So expect infrastructure funding and actually executing against infrastructure to get progressively worse over the next 10 to 15 years. And that should be a big warning to many industries, but also the construction industry. It should be the main concern of the building industry. However, the building industry itself seems to have lost interest in the importance of infrastructure for their industry and for their future prosperity, which is unfortunate. And we definitely encourage a renewed interest in holding our politicians' feet to the fire about infrastructure, full well knowing that infrastructure will be the first to go if debt levels and financing debt levels actually becomes a problem, which it has. And you may not have noticed, but we're just about to enter into a credit cycle, and we haven't seen a credit cycle in 27 years. So for a lot of people, that will be new, and essentially credit cycles are situations in which no one can do anything about it. There is no place to hide when a credit cycle occurs. So interest rates, there are hiding places, but when there is a credit cycle, even the government doesn't have control over interest rates. So the tax burden has been increasing, and as Marlon put it earlier on, and we noticed some of our numbers were showing up in his report, which we're really thrilled about. It seems that new homes and housing has become a bit of a piggy bank for municipalities that are starved of fiscal revenue tools, for a province that has got its back against the wall because it is not able to invest in infrastructure to the extent it can, because there's another level of government that's sucking all the oxygen out of the room, and it's called the federal government. And they're not putting in anywhere near the sufficient amount of money in order for our communities to be able to have the proper infrastructure to grow and be prosperous and everything else. And yet they've got control of the immigration policies, which sort of seems to be rather illogical. So the tax burden, it took us a while to work ourselves through all the municipal accounting, which is incredibly complicated, to sort of to level off that the tax burden in the purchase price of a new home is about 31%, and that's been going up since 2014. And the irony is that taxation on housing is twice as much as that on the rest of the economy, which really makes no sense. People say growth pays for growth, or growth, infrastructure growth should pay for infrastructure growth. But if that was the case, then all goods and services would have an infrastructure surcharge on them. And I'm not suggesting another tax in this country, because another tax will just, again, overlay the fact that we don't spend money properly at government. We don't invest money properly in government. We've done a calculation that looking at the entire country, you could easily save, $50 to $80 billion in improving efficiencies across this country, but it will never happen. And there are good reasons why, there are reasons why we don't actually see that happening anytime soon until we really reach an existential crisis. And that's when things might change in this country. But at the moment, there are way too many political elements and, what we would call thought opinion leaders that are just sort of snug and in their place and, happy to sort of watch on the sidelines. When you have a look at the breakdown of taxation of homes, the primary culprits are sales taxes and production taxes, of which development charges are an example of production taxes. And they're the main culprits of the taxation growth around homes. And again, just for emphasis, why are homes taxed at twice the rate of the rest of the economy? It makes no sense at all. So having a look at production taxes in the top right-hand corner here, you can see that production and sales tax on new homes is 1.7 times the rest of the economy, and now it's 2.6 times. Again, which makes no sense at all. And on the bottom left-hand side, we've given you a sense of production taxes across the Ontario economy. And as you can see there, new homes are the most taxed in our society when it comes to production taxes. And again, it's done under the auspices of, we need to do this because of the cost of infrastructure. I'll make the point again. If the cost of infrastructure is important and to be able to source funds from those that use the cost of infrastructure. Okay, sorry, host has asked me to turn on my video. Hi, everyone. Then what about motor vehicles? No, you can't touch motor vehicles because it's a highly protected industry in this country. In manufacturing or, cannabis stores or wineries and distilleries, they're all taxed at a fraction of what new homes are taxed. My point being is that infrastructure supports all economic activity, not just a home. And it's important to recognize that just looking at new homes as a source of infrastructure, and amazingly, when you look at all the taxation that comes out of homes in Ontario, it almost equals the total infrastructure bill. So we kind of are using new homes to actually fund ultimately what many sources of revenue should be funding, being infrastructure. As I said, and this is a real concern, infrastructure is the first to go when we go through a credit cycle and when government basically starts to run out of discretionary spending and debt. And we've gotten ourselves into a really ripe position where over the next 15 to 20 years, it really doesn't actually look that good. And, the Gen Ys and Gen Zs, they should be angry for what previous generations have set them up for. So in terms of the tax burden being 31% on a new home, like $1 million, it's $310,000. On the left-hand side, the final cost of a new home, government's 31%. And then we've calculated for land and materials, 23%. Construction workers, they get 17%. Suppliers, 11%. Developers, 10%. Suppliers to the construction industry, 7%. So where does it make sense when government is actually making not 82% more than construction workers in the construction of a new home? Or over, let's say 2 times more than that, more than developers. And again, I'll talk about the current financial situation and the economy. Is interest rates are high, you're going to get credit risk coming in. A lot of the developers, they have big balance sheets and they can actually make more money not building. and you're going to actually see them starting to turn the tap off on wanting to build. And that's why you're beginning to see, in some part, this downturn in the formation of new homes. The other thing, while I've got the opportunity, is also have a look, because Marlon covered a lot of different factors that are warping market dynamics and reduced, say, real estate sales. Someone should be having a really good look at what rental control has done to both the immobility of workers and its impact upon the ability to be able to sell homes. And the fact that, landlord and tenant tribunals are backlogged and everything else, it really has caused a logjam on mobility. And the problem is, when you've got immobility across economies and societies, they break down. Essentially, they're living things, they're living systems. They require to be able to move and breathe, and things are really getting jammed up. But as I said, when we've looked at all the different factors and what actually has to happen in order for the housing crisis to be remedied, when you put the machines to work, it's almost a near zero probability that it will actually get fixed over the next 15 or 20 years. And that's unfortunate. But that's the society we live in. And that's essentially the way Canada has been set up, with big oligopolies. And then you've got the other extreme of a lot of handouts and things like that. But part of the problem is that no one's at the wheel. Part of the problem is that there is not an overarching strategy. Canada in the G8 is the only country without a national housing strategy. I believe in the G20, we're the only country that doesn't have a national infrastructure strategy. So, the business of coordination and cooperation across this country is not, it doesn't exist. And that's rather unfortunate, because the country has so much opportunity before it. So does growth pay for growth? And one of the underlying themes of this presentation is that no, growth, it doesn't pay for growth. We're hitting houses because the narrative's been picked up both locally and provincially that growth pays for growth. The federal government gets 39% of the tax that comes out of the new home, and yet it only puts 7% in for infrastructure in this province. So for every 39 cents of a dollar of revenue generated that the federal government gets, it only pays back 7 cents of every dollar invested in public infrastructure. And we are not going to get out of this situation until the federal government actually gets serious and starts actually playing its role. If you have a look at the way the federal government's raised taxes over the last 50 years, it has downloaded a lot of responsibility over the last 50 years to provinces and municipalities, and yet it has not changed its tax rates. So the federal government's essentially had crowded out the provinces. The provinces can't increase tax rates. They can't really change their revenue source of funding or their ability, because the federal government's essentially crowded out. The federal government is sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And part of the problem with that is that you're getting all this money going to the federal government, and because the federal government has a lot less responsibilities at its level, a lot of that money and revenue becomes discretionary. And we know what discretionary funds look like to politicians. And we've been experiencing what happens with discretionary funds at a political level. And we need coordination, cooperation, and we need actual strategy. But again, from a Canadian point of view, that doesn't seem to work very well. There's been a few attempts at it, but there seems to be some reasons as to why it won't get off the ground. The federal government is 9.7 times, makes 9.7 times more out of new homes than the province, and almost 7 times more than the municipalities. And just think for a minute, the federal government is in control of immigration. It can turn the spigot on and off anytime it likes. And so while it is opening up immigration, which is required, which was the earlier point of the presentation, while it opens it up and it receives a bulk of the taxation revenues from an increase in the population, it does very little to actually pay for it. And that is a problem that will not go away. It is a systemic issue. And it is ultimately bringing, a breakdown in our societies and in, the ability of people to live and cost of living and things of that nature. Unfortunately, it seems, particularly in this country, things really don't happen until things really, really break, and they break bad. And that's unfortunate because that means people get hurt. And we've been talking about this along with Marlon and others, for over a decade in terms of these issues. None of these issues are a surprise to us. And it's unfortunate because good planning can actually navigate the system through these challenges. Okay, so concluding remarks, the point being is that the federal government has to come to the table in a major way. A previous study that we did, so the study that this presentation is based upon was due to RCCAO funding the research study, which we're very grateful for. There was another study that RCCAO funded about 6 or 7 years ago. And that's where we calculated that on a provincial basis, the Ontario government actually doesn't make a rate of return on infrastructure. The problem is that because all the taxation revenues that come from the development of infrastructure and people live, work and play, and the economy is using infrastructure, a lot of the taxation revenues are going out of province. And so the province is in a really difficult place because it knows it has to do infrastructure, and yet it also has probably come to understand that it doesn't make a rate of return on infrastructure because there's something else in the room that is sucking out the oxygen, and it's the federal government. So when you've got a thing that is degrading the health of the very thing that it's living off, I think it's called a parasite, but that is not a sustainable situation. And that's essentially the problem that we've got here is that the money is being raised and yet it's leaving the province and it's not coming back to the province in a way, shape or form that would actually help the municipalities on the ground because they're in dire straits from a fiscal revenue point of view. But it seems that every level of government is just basically boxed them in. And said, "Hey, it's it's your problem. It's not ours." And it ultimately comes down to the federal government's got to take real leadership and really start to sort of look at this issue of what it actually has to put back in order to be able to support our societies and to be able to get things built and things made and produced. And in this case, the federal government really needs to come to the table and at least increase its contribution to infrastructure, at least 3 times, which is very close to the development charge costs that we're now seeing coming out of municipalities. Without the federal government coming to the table and having a real plan and starting to sort of acknowledge that it needs to actually give back some of the funds that leave the different provinces in order for them to build out for new immigration and for the sustainability of Canadian society. Without that, this crisis will just get progressively worse. And that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. We have a few questions here. One coming in from the Q&A right here is, does this analysis take municipal property tax revenues into account? Presumably new housing increases the property tax base and provides a permanent recurring source of revenue for municipalities.
Right. So no, we didn't take that into account because we actually wanted to keep the focus, and the research question was very much on how much taxation is in a new home. So that was our primary focus. But you're right. And we've had these debates with councillors at a regional level and at the local municipal level is that when they say growth pays for growth, current residents are beneficiaries of growth. And yet the conversation is, you know, the new members of their community should be paying the whole bill. Whereas, and particularly as people get older and they're aging in place, they're beneficiaries of growth. But that seems to, you know, be lost on the political messaging side of things.
Okay. We have another question that just came in from Robert Marshall. So why is the federal government funding municipality, I think it's bureaucracy rather than infrastructure?
Funding municipal bureaucracy, I'm not sure what that question is. It's but what I will say is we took into account all federal transfers back to municipalities. And so all these numbers are basically net numbers in terms of what the federal government is actually getting. In terms of bolstering bureaucracies, I'm not exactly sure what that question is. So maybe, Robert, if you can rephrase the question, I'd be happy to answer it.
Awesome. All right. Well, maybe while Robert does that, I have a question for you. What specific areas of public infrastructure in Ontario are most affected by the federal government's lack of sufficient investment? And how has this impacted the quality of life for residents?
Transportation, roads, water and wastewater are all in dire need of being funded. You know, it's also not just about spending money on infrastructure, it's also how it's spent. For example, a significant part of Toronto, for example, has grown since 2001. But when you look at Toronto, only half of it's grown and it's got really dense, and the other half has actually shrunk. And so in terms of the infrastructure, we've calculated that that infrastructure was laid prior to 2001, expecting a certain number of people at the end of the pipe. Well, guess what? They're not there. So that infrastructure doesn't have a rate of return. And we've calculated that the diminution of the rate of return is about 22% on that particular infrastructure. So, you know, that's part of the problem is that it's not just infrastructure, it's about infrastructure in the right place and the right time, because there's a lot of timing differences that are around the development of infrastructure and actually then building things and servicing land and actually building new homes. So for the federal government, again, it's primarily transportation, roads, water and wastewater is a big one. And now that the federal government has been very aggressive on climate change changes, water and wastewater just got a whole lot more expensive, such that it can be stress tested at the new climate change levels.
Okay. What would you say to municipalities that argue they cannot spend their CAPEX reserves because they don't have sufficient APEX funding from the provincial and federal levels of government?
No, that's really a political question, and we don't touch the political side of things at all. The thing is that, again, a municipality can only do what it can do. And if there's insufficient funding, then, you know, it's the same way as the hospital system and the healthcare system works here. By law, a hospital can't run at a loss. Well, guess what? Some hospitals run at losses. Just because there's a law against it doesn't mean that it's, you know, it's not going to happen. You know, for several, you know, our experience across Ontario municipalities and elsewhere in the country is when provincial levels basically says, oh, you must do something. You know, the running joke amongst municipalities is that, look, we can plan according to what the rules say, but does the execution actually occur underneath? So, you know, like I said, it's I feel really bad for municipalities, particularly in the fact that they don't have stability in infrastructure funding. Another study that we did for the Canadian Construction Association, Canada is a lot worse than Mexico when it comes to the experience with infrastructure. So when you have a look at infrastructure funding and the fact that it's turned off and on in Canada, that's what we call the volatility of infrastructure funding. Canada's volatility of infrastructure funding is 3.5 times more than Mexico. So, you know, in terms of, and now Mexico is the US's largest trading partner. Canada's losing its way. You know, Canada considers itself on the world global scene as, you know, being progressive and forward-looking and everything else. But as it's starting to come out on the inside, Canada's, you know, a little bit of a shit show. And, you know, you only need to start comparing ourselves to other countries, and that slide in terms of home approvals and things like that, and where Canada is the second last country in the world. That's when we brought that to Richard a couple of years ago. You know, basically saying, you know, where's our benchmark? Because we seem to have lost the benchmark. And, you know, when politicians want to grab a benchmark that's convenient for them, they typically don't probably choose the US or something. Whereas the US is a completely different situation to Canada from an economic point of view. And they have control of the globe's reserve currency. So we can't benchmark against US at all. So it's unfortunate that, you know, even developing countries, as they become developed countries, you know, are basically showing Canada up in its inability to be able to, you know, socioeconomically share the wealth and to cooperate and coordinate across, you know, a Byzantine set of rules and across many levels of government.
Thank you. Thank you for thank you, Paul, but also thank you to our audience here. We've lots of great questions. And Paul, I was going to say there are more questions there in the chat. If you get a chance and you want to go in there and address those, you can absolutely get there. Mm-hmm. But now our next session, Streamlining and Modernization of Development Approvals, will be started at 3:05. So we got about 5 minutes here again, just to quick bio break, maybe check an email or any kind of quick things, but don't miss the 3:05 start because we got a lot of good stuff still to come. Welcome back to the Housing Summit 3.0, Driving Solutions to the Crisis. This event is presented by RESCON and sponsored by the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Toronto, and Stories. Now I would like to introduce David Amborski and Arash Shahi for our session on streamlining and modernization of development approvals. First up, I'd like to introduce David. He's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University's School of Urban and Regional Planning and the founding director of the Centre for Urban Research and Land Development. His research and consulting work explores topics where urban planning interfaces with economics, including land and housing markets. His specific interests include the areas of municipal finance, land development, and land value capture tools. David has been an advisor on numerous projects, both locally and internationally, but recently, and very relevant to today's conversation, he was a member of the province's Affordable Housing Task Force. Also joining us today in this session is Arash. Arash is a highly accomplished entrepreneur and innovator with significant achievements across the architectural, engineering, construction, and academic sectors. Serving as CEO at AECO Innovation Lab, Arash leverages his experience, education, and passion to drive digital technology adoption in AAC and related industries and governments. Arash holds a PhD in construction engineering and management technologies and co-founded the Building Innovation Research Center at the University of Toronto. I will hand the session over to you, very competent gentlemen. And you have it, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm going to try and frame the problem, identify the issues that need to be addressed, and then Arash will talk about a potential solution to this. Next slide, please. What I want to cover quickly is the history of the problem, pointing out it's been an issue for a long time, and then talk a bit about the current process and what the impacts are in terms of timelines and costs, and identify some of the recent attempts to improve the process and indicate how it hasn't really been a solution yet, and kind of point out what needs to be done. I think we all know a lot about this problem and issue. We know the planning approvals process in Ontario is a very lengthy process. It's inefficient. It leads to increased costs and delays lead to a slowdown of the supply coming on stream more quickly. So through that, it also impacts on affordability in both the case of the profit sector and the nonprofit sectors. They both seem to face the same issues along these lines. So it affects market and non-market housing across the board. It's been a persistent problem, as I'll point out, for a number of years, and there have been attempts to address it recently, and I'm not sure any of them are really kind of capturing the solutions to the problems. We have heard about this before. I talk about the historical perspective from the mayors. They talked about speed being important. We have heard about this from the Altus people, and they all talk about this as being an issue, so it's very relevant. It's not the only thing that needs to be addressed, but it's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. From a historical perspective, you can go back to the 1970s when we had the Federal Provincial Land Price Study. They looked at the wasn't the problem, but it was a contributing factor. And you go back to the 1990s, and this was recognized by the province where they put out streamlining guidelines in the development review process, trying to encourage municipalities to address the issue. Then across Canada basis, there's a report on streamlining approvals, a pilot study funded by CMHC, trying to look at this being addressed on a Canada-wide basis. It's been consistently addressed by a number of people. Earlier, it was referred to in terms of the World Bank rankings, in terms of their cost of doing business report, where Canada ranked 54 out of 190 countries based on issuing building permits, not the entire process, but one component of it. You know, RealPAC tried to address this by looking at Canada-wide development rules process. They did a survey showing what the issues were. The Ontario Association of Architects took this on as well in 2013. There was another study done in 2018. So people have been looking at this as a problem and an issue. More recently, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that RESCON worked jointly with our Center for Urban Research and Land Development, looking at the building permit process of how to modernize that. So we tried to address that, made some solutions, again, made some suggestions. It hasn't gone forward, but did get some resonance with the provincial government. The Province Affordable Housing Task Force that I sat on identified this as being an issue as well. And it was picked up in one of the policy changes by the provincial government. And also, nationally, CMHC recognizes this being an issue in terms of their funding for research under the Housing Supply Challenge. They've identified the approvals process improvement and efficiency was something that needed to be addressed from a research perspective, and they've created funding for a number of background studies to address this issue, one of which was funding for ACO of One Ontario, looking at this issue specifically in Simcoe County. This issue, if you go to the next slide, points out that we're not talking about one component, we're talking about a number of components in the approvals process. We can go with the formal planning approvals process. It's required under the Planning Act for all of the various types of applications and processes that are in place. We also can look at the appeals process, which tends to slow things down because many times we find appeals. These appeals can be through the Ontario Land Tribunal, or people can appeal to local appeal board, TLAB, or Committee of Adjustment for various kinds of aspects. We also look at the issuance of building permits as a third component. So all these components comprise the entire process. Now, one of the research components that have come into play looking at these issues has been work done by Altus. And again, we had a presentation by Altus earlier, and they did, next slide, please. They had one of the reviews for the Ontario Association of Architects. Then they've done 3 different studies for a bill, 2 being benchmarking studies on the approvals process, and 1 looking at more specifically at appeals to the Committee of Adjustment to get things approved for minor variances. If we look at the Altus 2022 benchmarking study, which is the next slide, some of the highlights that come into play, they call it a benchmarking study because they were able to compare 2020 to 2022. And what they've identified, according to their research, is that approval timeline has increased by 41% over that time period. And depending on a type of application, it may have increased by 27 to 53%. So things weren't getting better, they're getting worse. Of course, we had a COVID issue during that time. It may have had some impacts. A number of municipalities said they were doing things during COVID. They began to take applications digitally, but didn't mean that they were improving the efficiency of the process. Just mean they're taking them in a digital format. Didn't mean they moved through the process on a digital basis. And again, I think identified earlier in the presentation by Altus is that one of the best municipalities in this perspective, Milton and Toronto, was down near the bottom of the pack on this. It didn't make any difference whether the applications were for larger or small municipalities. They're all facing the same kinds of things. Altus also tried to estimate the cost of delays. They said it was from $2.60 to $3.30 per square foot per month for additional application time coming into play. And again, municipality said, well, why did this happen? Well, we had staffing problems, which was an issue. That's clear. There's a shortage of planners. It's an issue right now. Applications had to be resubmitted with more details. And they also indicated their problems, the need to comply with provincial requirements. The work on the next slide is talked about from the Committee of Adjustment. And again, this is just one component, but we haven't looked at some of the things like TRREB or the Ontario Land Tribunal, but they just showed in this particular study, when they examined applications over a 7-year period, that the volume of applications increased dramatically. And the volume, of course, leads to more delays because you don't have the capacity to deal with them. Delays have added 8 to 14% of construction costs, which translates in between $9 and $19 per square foot per year. And again, it shows how much likely the times have been. They said the average decision time was 95 days, 65 days longer than expected under the Planning Act, and even 32 days longer than the city's own guideline for trying to get these things accomplished. So again, inefficiencies come into play. There have been some recent attempts to address the issue. If we go to the next slide, when we did that report on the building permit process, we submitted that to the province, and the then Secretary of Cabinet Committee thought it was an issue. So he assembled a working group on development approvals, which was comprised of municipality, municipal officials, and also people in the development and building industry. They issued a report on development approvals process, which then got passed over to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and they were to act on this. They commissioned a consulting report, but it was never released. And I know they commissioned the report because I talked to the person who was working on it for a specific consulting firm, but then it kind of died in the ministry and never went any further. The City of Toronto has undertaken its own initiative. They had a program called Concept to Keys, C2K, trying to speed up the process. That seemed to fail and not proceed as well. It had some internal pressures put on it. Following that, Mayor Tory was trying to set up a new structure to deal with this, and then unfortunately he left, so that kind of fell flat as well. So again, we have a number of failed attempts that came into play. As I mentioned before, the province followed up on some of the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Task Force, and part of that came in the More Homes for Everyone Act. And that particular case, they decided to put some penalties in place if approval timelines weren't met. In other words, if they didn't meet the 60-day timeline, the municipality had to rebate part of the application fees. This isn't something that I thought was particularly a strong approach, using this kind of taxation approach. I think an incentive approach might be better. I think somebody else talked about incentives earlier as an approach that might be something that's more useful. But what this actually created was the fact that municipalities didn't want to pay the penalties, so they started to require more complex and more detailed information being submitted before an application was deemed to be a complete application. So what they did, they pushed back the workload to before the application is filed. So it really didn't change the overall time frame significantly of the entire background work to be done, but just shifted to being done before the complete application was filed. I think 8 or 9 municipalities actually put these requirements into their official plan by various amendments to try and institutionalize it. If we go to the next slide, there's a couple other initiatives that came into play. At the 2022 AMO conference, the Premier announced a $45 million grant program to improve the approvals process given to municipalities. I'm not sure what the outcome of this has been entirely. Our senator tried to get some details on this, and we weren't able to get the details whether that actually yielded any kind of application, but applied programs that improve the process. I think that some municipalities did start to hire consultants to look at this. But again, this creates a very piecemeal approach of very different processes in different municipalities. AMO was promoting looking at building permits through a cloud permit program. They're trying to encourage that as building efficiency into the building permit program by sort of looking at that one component. And the big profile recently is through the National Housing Strategy and the Accelerator Fund. I think the mayor has referred to that as being a potential help in terms of speeding up the process. If you look at the next slide, it just outlines the details of this fund. It's a $4 billion incentive program for lower tier governments with the outcome objective of creating 100,000 additional building permits issued in Canada over the next 3-year period. So this was an attempt to speed up the process. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see there's been 2 announcements of municipalities receiving this funding. London, the city of London received $74 million, which is intended to speed up or at least increase their production over the next 3 years by 2,000 units. And Vaughan received $59 million with the objective of creating another 1,700 additional homes over the next 3 years as well. I'm not sure if those estimates were actually done at the application stage, which may be before the impact of the increased interest rates, may make it more challenging to meet those targets, or they're done more recently. So it could be a little optimistic from that perspective. And again, if we go to the last slide as kind of my conclusions, we have a lot of piecemeal approaches in place, but we know that the system has been very inefficient. It's been recognized as a problem for a long period of time. We've been documenting the impacts now with the work of Altus, which hadn't been done in earlier years. We don't see a great deal of progress over that period of time, 40 or 50 years of moving forward. Most attempts, as the ones that I've highlighted, have been piecemeal, when you're looking at one component of the process, like the building permit process, or you're looking at different approaches in different municipalities. I think you need a more comprehensive approach, having a common platform across all municipalities. In the UK, TerraQuest does provide that system of a uniform application that the developers put the same application in for all municipalities, and then it's a common approach and everybody understands it. If we're going to have any kind of system that's more common in Ontario, we have to have a couple of components that are essential for that to take place. First of all, we have to have the appropriate technological platform, and that's something that now it takes things in electronically, but moves them across the system in an efficient fashion. It has to be user-friendly for both the developers and builders submitting them, and also the government agencies who are approving the process and giving feedback. And it also may require some change management within the approval agencies. People may need to be trained, may need to hire more people to make sure that you have the capacity to deal with these issues in an efficient fashion. So that's where I'll leave it. I'll turn it over to Rash to talk about some approach that he has been working on to try and address this issue. And happy to handle questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that presentation. So just want to talk about all this research that's been done over the last number of decades. How do we move that to solutions that the industry and the government can use? And that was the purpose of putting Eco Innovation Lab together. We provide a platform for collaborative research and development. And the goal is to be able to move that research outcomes from university and academia all the way to solutions the industry can use. We have had, as David mentioned, from 1990s, we've been talking about this. Politicians come and go, governments come and go, the problems stay. And that's an indication of us not doing the right thing. So doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, it's probably not going to work. The good news is that by us being the last or almost the last jurisdiction in the world between the developed countries in terms of how we deal with building permits, there is a lot of examples ahead of us that we can learn from. So what One Ontario is about. One Ontario started as a collaborative R&D platform within Eco Innovation Lab. And the idea there was to not reinvent the wheel, was to look outside, look at other jurisdictions, learn from what others have done, and bring those best practices to the Canadian and the Ontario market. One of the projects that we did in my days, started in my days back in U of T, was we spent about 4 years and looked at every electronic approval platform in the developed countries. So we looked internationally, everywhere from Singapore to UK to other jurisdictions, lessons learned, what have they done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and we put them into 3 categories of digitization. So level 0 being paper-based, that's where some of our municipalities still are. Level 1 is basically permitting, so digital submission of 2D drawings, still very manual process, but at least paperless. And then when you go towards model-based submission and BIM and GIS integration is where you move from digitization to automation. And that's, the research is now quite a few years old, but even back then, we had a number of jurisdictions that were pushing level 3 BIM GIS integration, while we still have Canadian municipalities in Ontario that are in level 0 and deal with level 1 as an accomplishment, which it really isn't. The takeaway here is that it's not a technology challenge; it's purely a change management challenge. And when you look at best practices, and I think that's where we need to start looking, and there is no need to reinvent the wheel. When we look at best practices, it's usually, in most cases, a top-down approach. We need leadership from outside of the municipality at the upper levels of government to actually make change happen. When we talk about building permits, for example, that's a very municipal task that happens within the municipality. But when we talk about planning applications, which is where the majority of the challenges are, you often have many jurisdictions outside of the municipality involved in that process. So the control is really not with the municipality. We need an upper tier government, preferably the provincial government, at the table to solve some of those challenges. So don't need to tell anybody on this platform on what the problems are. We all know what the problems are. One thing that I want to highlight is the fragmented and the siloed approach that we've taken towards this. When we look at Ontario market specifically, and we've spent about 10 years now, myself and with David, a few decades looking at this. One of the challenges that we have that's very unique to Ontario is that we have the provincial government and federal government that push money down to municipalities. The 40 million that David mentioned was a good example. Money came to municipalities and they had 1 year to go buy a solution, right? Now, what we ended up with now after a number of years is that everybody has many solutions internally, lower tier municipalities, upper tier regional government, conservation authorities, you name it. Everybody has tools. None of those tools actually talk to each other, and everybody is built unique for individual municipalities. So we really haven't solved the applicant problem that needs to deal with number of municipalities, a number of agencies on a single application. So this was the challenge that we kind of set to solve for ourselves. And the solution, based on, again, industry best practices internationally, was to create a hub that provides a data exchange platform between all these different systems. So the question was, how can we protect the investments that municipalities have already made into their systems? And how can we provide a platform that solves the many challenges that exist? And the decision was to basically provide a data exchange platform, if you will, to communicate between these different agencies. A number of research projects I can talk about. One example is we had 15 chief building officials for about 18 months together, working on this initiative, trying to standardize the permitting process. After 18 months, basically gave up because we couldn't even agree on terminology, right? Whether it's a single family dwelling or a single detached home or whatever the vocabulary is. And part of that was because of all the legacy systems that exist in municipalities. Another challenge was municipalities having e-permitting systems, inviting conservation, for example, to log in, and conservation refusing. We talked to conservation, and their point was that we deal with 18 different municipalities. We can't log into 18 different systems, built one system, and we can connect them. So that kind of feedback came together in shaping the One Ontario. And the goal here was not to ask anybody to change, because we all know that's tall order. But what we decided to do was, let's map everybody's definition to a common definition that we can then use that language to communicate. So that was the premise and the philosophy of One Ontario. With that, we went to the industry and we got overwhelming support. We had about 40 agencies in Ontario, starting with RESCON and many other folks on this slide that supported this idea of being able to work together. What was really interesting for me was that we had building officials, planners, conservation authorities, everybody, Toronto Real Estate Board, residential construction, as well as the general contractors. Everybody came together Whereas before there was a lot of finger pointing, right? But when we said we want to work together on this solution, everybody came together. What's missing on this slide is the provincial government, which that's part of the problem of having that leadership not at the table. But we did go to the federal government, and we said that, you know what, we have 40 agencies in Ontario who want to work together and solve this problem and see if we can get some federal support. So we did. Through CMHC, we got some funding to be able to move this research initiative into a commercial solution. And that happened last year, 2022. And I'm happy to report today that One Ontario is live. One Ontario as a solution has been built, has been tested. We have a number of municipalities who supported us throughout the development of it, and we're starting with them to onboard them. And starting in the new year, we're ready to take on more municipalities and start to connect different agencies together. But in order to provide a sustainable model, because as an innovation lab, we're looking for innovative solutions to get things done. A lot of challenges were made to One Ontario in terms of the data ownership, the structure. It's another monopoly that's going to come into market, and that's exactly what we didn't want to do. So the decision has been made. I'm happy to announce today that One Ontario will be operating as a non-for-profit in the province of Ontario. And there was a number of reasons why we decided to go this route. First of all, we have a solution that's been tested. We have a large group of following within the province who've agreed to support us and have been supporting us over the years. But as we want to, the goal here is to put together a sustainable model going forward. And we think as a non-for-profit, it allows One Ontario to prioritize community benefits over profit, making sure data is used for what it's supposed to be used. Having this type of data in the hands of the private sector wasn't something that many of our partners were comfortable with. Open integration and collaboration, we embrace software vendors. We would like to connect software vendors together, but we're going to promote industry and international open exchange data standards. And that's very important because we are fundamentally against monopolies in the market, and that doesn't serve anybody, not the people nor the government. So the goal here is to have open data exchange platform. We have international ties with standard associations that support that kind of exchange. And that's the basis for One Ontario. We also have a number of leading e-permitting systems who agreed and have started to integrate with One Ontario. So over the next course of next few months, we're going to have announcements of different e-permitting systems coming on board, which is great. The another reason for this decision was that we wanted to add transparency and accountability. There needs to be openness. There needs to be transparency into the process, not just for the government, but also for the private sector to understand how data is being handled. So that was another reason for going not-for-profit. And again, being able to reinvest some of the funding and explore innovation, because again, looking at other jurisdictions, this problem has been solved over and over again. We are not reinventing the wheel. We're simply taking best practices from other examples and bring them here in the Ontario market. And we want to continue to develop. We have very good pool of talent in this province. We as a province are a lot better than being one of the last players. When you look at all the reports that Paul was saying and Richard was saying, Ontario and Toronto keep ranking last. We are much better than that. And the solution is actually not that complicated. We have lots of examples ahead of us. I know time is tight, so I'll wrap up the presentation by saying that in One Ontario, the goal is to work together. We have to have a collaborative solution. If a municipality could have solved this, they would have by now. If any of the e-permitting providers or any of the private companies or major consulting firms could have solved this, they would have already. It's been going on for more than 20 years. I think now it's time for a different approach. And we believe that One Ontario, with all the support that it has, as a non-for-profit, will be able to be well positioned to engage with all levels of government to make this happen. With that said, we are, with this announcement today, we are inviting government agencies, municipalities, if they want to get involved with Ontario, please go on our website and sign up. Industry partners, developers, at the end of the day, they are the beneficiary of a platform like this. We want to hear from you. And we'd like to thank RESCON for their continued support of research. They supported this research back in the day when I was at UFT, and been supporting One Ontario from the very early days. So we like to have industry partners at the table. Any solution providers, any e-permitting providers, anybody who is working in this space and is willing to connect and work towards this collaboration, please sign up. Also, individuals, advisors, people who are passionate about this space. I extend this invite to everybody who presented today or participated in this session. If you're passionate about this, if you have ideas to offer, we would like to hear from you. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation and open it up for any questions.
All right, thank you, Arash. I know the one question that's popping up in more than one person's mind right now, and I'm not sure if you can share the info, but which municipalities are you working with?
So the logo wall had a number of municipalities set up, but the funding from the CMHC that we received was to build a scalable solution that could be scaled across Ontario and Canada. And the jurisdictions that started with this was Simcoe County as operative government. So we are involved with Simcoe County as well as a number of municipalities within Simcoe. So we are now, we have a number of e-permitting providers who've come on board who are integrating. So as those e-permitting providers connect, then those municipalities will start to come online.
Fantastic. We have maybe one minute for a quick question. So from Zoe, this is such an exciting product. Congratulations. My question is, how have you brought municipalities on board with One Ontario when they've already invested in legacy technologies? And what is the plan to bring in provincial permitting, such as EA permits, into your platform?
Yeah, so on the issue of bringing municipalities, what was interesting for me personally and working with One Ontario and the coalition was that it wasn't difficult bringing people on board because we're not changing anything. Like, we're not asking them to change. We are trying to basically fill a vacuum that is the interagency communication, right? So every municipality still has their own systems in place, but the moment they need to communicate with someone outside of the municipality, that's where it starts to fall apart. And from a provincial standpoint, because that space is a vacuum, there's nothing in that space. A lot of communication is happening through emails and fax, and a lot of finger pointing that municipalities saying it's conservation's fault, conservation saying I don't have the full application. So that's the space that we're trying to fill. That's the work that we're trying to fill. What has been very interesting over the last few months as we are testing out the platform was the buy-in from e-permitting systems, right? So as e-permitting systems, our municipalities have already paid for them. So when an e-permitting system says, I will connect to One Ontario, that means all the municipalities that are working with that e-permitting system can then connect seamlessly. So that's been a good way for us to gain momentum. That was the first question. What was the second question?
No, I think that's perfect. We're out of time, but the questions still remain in the Q&A there. So David and Arash, I encourage you both to go see if you can take a look and type your answers in there potentially. So thank you. Thank you for this presentation. So in a few minutes, we're going to begin our next session, which is tax changes to unlock purpose-built rental communities. So again, take this opportunity to quickly refresh your coffee or water, and we'll be right back here at 3:40. Welcome back once again. I'd like to introduce our presenter for the tax changes to unlock purpose-built rental communities. We have Dr. Mike Moffat, who's the founding director of the Place Center at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Mike's research focuses on the intersection of regional economic development, building child-friendly, climate-friendly housing and communities, and clean innovation. In 2017, Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, advising deputy ministers on innovation policy and emerging trends. He's worked with politicians and policymakers of all political stripes in several countries to craft more effective public policy. From 2013 to 2015, Mike served as an economic advisor to Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. And Mike, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. So let me see if I can share my screen here correctly. So, going to talk a little bit about tax changes to unlock purpose-built rental communities. There's a lot of bottlenecks to building housing, both on the rental and the ownership side. And we've seen governments address these, particularly lately at the federal level. So in recent weeks, we've seen additional conditions put on the housing accelerator. We've seen an increase in Canada mortgage bond allotments by $20 billion a year. The big one that we've seen is the removal of GST on purpose-built rentals, which was originally what this presentation was going to be about, but that's happened now, so we don't need to dwell on that one. And all of those are helpful. All of those are helpful, but they don't, they're not going to get us by themselves to where we need to be. There's all kinds of changes, policy changes that we need to see from all three orders of government. Most of them aren't tax related, but I think there are some tax changes that could be helpful here. So I'm going to focus on those, and I'll leave a fair bit of time for questions. So just to review that, Ontario has a target of 1.5 million homes in 10 years. At the Place Center, we did a report in 2022 looking to see if this target made sense. And long story short, it does. It really did illustrate our need for housing at the time. Now, we reran those figures about a month ago in light of additional international student enrollment and increased immigration to the province. We wanted to road test those that number. So we looked at recent Ministry of Finance population projections for Ontario. We reran the figures, and we found out that the need is probably about 1.7 million homes from that 10-year period from the start of 2022 to the end of 2031. So this is an even bigger need than we first thought. I've heard the Premier say, throw out figures like 1.7, 1.8. We find it's about 1.7 is the need. That's a problem because that's about 170,000 on average we need over this 10-year period. And because of those economic conditions, current economic conditions, we're looking to see starts or completions, whichever metric you want to use, stay at or under 100,000 for the foreseeable future. There's just a lot of projects right now that just aren't penciling out, but again, could with some tax reform. And I think we need to put this need into some historical context. So what we did is we looked at housing completions over any 10-year period in Ontario. So in any given 10 years, how many houses did we complete? And our record is just over 800,000 in any 10-year period. So Ontario's never completed even 850,000 housing units in any 10-year period ever. Ontario's hasn't completed 750,000 in any 10-year period since 1973 to 1982, which is basically, if you remember the TV show MASH, that's when they were making, that was the sort of run of MASH, 1973 to 1982. So we need to do something that we haven't done in 40 to 50 years since they were making new episodes of MASH, and double it in the same amount of time. And I would argue that it's even more challenging than that because we've been shifting a little bit to building a lot more, one bedroom and studio apartment units when we have a real shortage of family-sized homes. And those could be homes in apartments, they could be homes in any sort of given form, but the sort of 3-bedroom plus, we're not building as many of those as we used to, and we need quite a few of them. So this is going to be a real challenge for us. What it indicates is that we need transformative policy changes. We're not going to get to where we need to be by just kind of tweaking at the margins. So I want to focus a little bit on tax, because what I'm going to suggest is that our tax system when it comes to housing, either federally or in Ontario, is very poorly designed. It doesn't accomplish what we need it to accomplish. So if we work from first principles and say, okay, well, what is the purpose of a tax system? The obvious one is to raise revenue, right? For the government to pay for healthcare and education and infrastructure. So I want to make it clear that this presentation is not an anti-tax presentation. And this presentation is not meant to be a small government type argument, right? We need to acknowledge that governments at all orders need to raise revenue to pay for the infrastructure that make for great family-friendly, climate-friendly communities. So we do need to raise money. The second purpose of taxation is to deal with issues of inequality, right? To prevent the gap from getting too large between the rich and the poor. And we can look at that from an income point of view or a wealth point of view. But, taxation has a redistributive effect, or at least a well-designed tax system does. It takes relatively more from the rich, takes relatively less from the poor. And the third way that we use the tax system is to price in negative externalities. So taxes on pollutions and that kind of thing. Other kinds of sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco and things like that. And, and to tax less or sometimes even subsidize things like innovation through lower taxes or even negative taxes. So we want to have higher taxes on bad things and lower taxes on good things, all else being equal. So those are really, from a first principles point of view, the three purposes of taxation. And I'm going to argue that our tax system kind of fails at these three, particularly when it comes to purpose-built rentals. Because we think about purpose-built rentals, that on average, the end user of a rental apartment tends to be lower income or wealth than somebody in an owner-occupied single detached home or even a condo unit or other lower density ownership types. So if we look at the sort of difference between the average family that lives in a high-rise rental apartment versus the average family that owns a single detached home, the owners of the single detached home are on average going to be much higher income and much higher wealth. So that would suggest in a tax system, we should have a fairly light touch on taxing lower income apartment dwellers, apartment renters. They should be taxed relatively less if we're designing our tax system well. The second thing is that higher density forms of housing on average are more environmentally friendly. They have a lower carbon footprint, and that's both in energy use in the actual building itself. That's also in the land use, changes from land use. They're in more walkable neighborhoods. People who live in apartment buildings, even when you control for income, they drive less, they walk more, they take more public transit because they're in more walkable neighborhoods, even when you control for income. So all else being equal, if we're trying to lower our carbon footprint, if we're trying to lower our environmental impact, that would suggest that we should tax high density apartment units less than other forms, just from sheer environmental considerations. We should not tax them all that much because they have all of these positive environmental benefits. Well, it turns out, so this is not our data, this comes from Construct Connect, but if we look at the city of Toronto, or we look across Ontario, the housing forms that get taxed the most on a square footage basis tends to be either low-rise rental or high-rise rental. So on a square footage basis, it pays more in property taxes and development charges and you name it. So our tax system works against building the kinds of housing forms that we need. They go against building communities that help low-income renters. They go against our environmental goals. So our tax system is completely messed up when it comes to housing. It's not well designed. So we should be thinking about how can we deal with that? How can we address the tax system to get more purpose-built rental, to allow for more purpose-built rental construction to take place while still ensuring that we have the infrastructure that we need. So again, there's a need to reform all of this. We need to reform the taxation regime, the development charges regime, land transfer taxes, you name it. Like, we need to take a whole of taxation approach and look at how can we reform the system? How can we better how can we lower the taxes on the kind of housing that we need? So this was one of the approaches, or one of the goals we had in mind when we put together the National Housing Accord. So this was a coalition of groups led by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, REALPAC, and the Place Center that I run. Call it a multi-sector approach to ending Canada's rental housing crisis. And we got dozens and dozens of endorsements on this, many of which are by folks who I know are currently in the room, the virtual room. So one of our 10 recommendations was that the federal government should help reform CMHC fees in the federal tax system, including changes to the capital cost provisions and eliminating the GST HST on purpose-built rentals to incentivize the construction of purpose-built rental housing. The GST HST reform has happened, but I think the capital cost provision should be the next one that could happen. It could be quite transformative without costing a lot of money. So what the government could do is introduce something called an accelerated capital cost allowance. And how it works is it basically increases the rate at which the depreciation for tax purposes of a capital investment can be expensed annually. And what that does is it decreases immediate tax obligations, it improves the cash position of the company making the investment, and it lowers the average cost of capital to encourage investment. This is a tool that the federal government has been using a lot of, going back to the Harper days, that particularly in manufacturing and clean energy, we have a lot of these things. So if you are investing in a solar farm, or your company, a manufacturing company, and you're investing in a piece of equipment and machinery, we have these accelerated capital cost allowance provisions to lower the cost of capital to encourage investment in those technologies, and they work well. So if we've decided as a society that we want more investment in the manufacturing sector, we use an ACA. We've decided as a society we want more investment in clean energy, renewable energy, and so on. So we've introduced an ACA. I believe that we have decided in this country that we want more purpose-built rental buildings, so we should do the same thing that we did in those other two domains and introduce an ACA. Because how things currently work is that the capital cost allowance depreciation rate for tax expensing purposes are about 4% a year, right? So you can basically deduct 4% a year of the cost of building an apartment building. So what happens is the book value of that building depreciates over time, which helps lower the tax bill for that company. But what also happens is that if that building actually appreciates in value, which it often does, that when the company sells that building, they're going to generate a capital gain, which is taxed. And this is problematic because what it does, the current provisions, is that they're not the current tax system just isn't attractive for enough projects to pencil out, because it suffers from two problems. That the first problem is that 4% just isn't enough to get projects over the line. But it suffers from a second problem that it also, over a 20, 30-year span, that companies, when they sell, will generate a capital gain that then gets taxed, which will discourage them from selling and discourage them from investing in building a new building. So it's essentially a broken system two ways. that the current system doesn't encourage enough purpose-built rentals, but it also doesn't encourage enough selling of purpose-built rentals and reinvesting those profits back into building new buildings. So what happens is there's just fewer apartment buildings built with all of those other taxes already applied to it. But we can fix that. And in fact, if we go back to the past, we had a system that worked, that prior to 1972, we had an accelerated capital cost regime for apartment buildings in Canada. And in fact, all of those things around, those manufacturing tax credits and the clean energy tax credits, in many cases are modeled over the old ACA regime that we had for apartments back in the 60s. So if you go back to the 1960s, there was an accelerated capital cost allowance of 10%. So you could depreciate the value of the construction price of that building by 10% over time, which substantially lowers the cost of capital for these projects, which decreases the immediate tax obligation, improves the cash position, lowers the average cost of capital, which is a good thing. The challenge is by itself, if you just do that, it causes a problem. It causes an obvious problem. That now with that ACA, that's going to cause companies to have a larger capital gain 20 to 30 years down the road when they sell. So by itself, the ACA creates a further disincentive to not sell, as it creates a larger capital gain, which is then taxed. But there's a fix for that. That under the pre-1972 system, owners of buildings could defer the capital gains taxes on the selling of a building of a purpose-built rental, so long as they reinvested the profits into building more purpose-built rentals. So what this does is it creates a virtuous cycle where the 10% ACA creates the incentive to build a building. The deferral provisions create an incentive to sell the building and then build a new one. So you get developers and builders who go through this cycle of they build a building, hold on to it a few years, sell it to a company to run, and build another one. And it's not a coincidence that we were building a lot more apartment buildings in the 60s and 70s with these kinds of provisions than we do today. So what would this cost the federal government? So one of the parties actually asked the Parliamentary Budget Office this question prior to the 2021 election. And they found that over 5 years, it would cost about $2.2 billion. The cost goes up over time. So this is not a costless system. This would cost the federal government some money, would cost the provinces some money as well. But I think it's a worthwhile investment, that the amount of new construction that we can unlock with this one simple tax change, that again was the system that we had up until 50 years ago, is worth that investment. And again, it's the same thing that we do on clean energy and green manufacturing. We've decided as a society we want those things. Then we should do the same thing on purpose-built rental, because we've decided as a society we'd like that as well. So to summarize, Ontario's only building half the units it needs to support population growth. And the reason for that, there's many reasons for that, but one of the biggest ones is that projects just aren't penciling right now due to economic conditions, particularly higher interest rates. One of the reasons is tax, that we've heard it before from one of the earlier presentations, and I'm saying it again. We can fix that. We basically treat apartment buildings, we apply a sin tax to apartment buildings, and that's the exact opposite approach than what we need. Solutions are out there. The GST-HST was a great move, but we got to do more. We should look to things that worked in the past. And governments do need to find other ways. We've only scratched the surface here, but I do believe that governments need to find other ways to fund this infrastructure that don't involve treating new building as something that should be taxed out of existence. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike. We have one question. I'm just going to say, for anyone that does have questions for Mike, please put them into the Q&A along the bottom toolbar you have there. If you get into the chat, they're harder for me to find. So put them into the Q&A. First question we have. So at Mike Moffat, what is your view in rent-to-own programs, and what can be done to support developers that have shovel-ready projects and are interested in building family-size units and delivering a rent-to-own program?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think further work needs to be done on that. On looking at what that model looks like, how we would what the cost to the treasury would be, and so on. So I don't think I've done enough work on that to be able to give an informed answer. But if anyone has, I would love to read that research. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need. I do think we need to start looking at innovative new models to try and figure out how to get stuff to pencil. Because again, it just right now, the GST helps, the Canada Mortgage Bond helps, but we got to go a lot further if we're going to get these projects to pencil out.
Next question for you here is, the federal and provincial governments have both agreed to remove the HST on the construction of purpose-built rental housing. What have been the historical effects of these kinds of tax incentives on the supply of rental housing, both in Canada and in other countries? Are there lessons that we can learn from past policies?
Yeah, unfortunately not. Just because Canada's the way that Canada taxes applies the GST to purpose-built rental is kind of novel. Unfortunately, I can't think of anywhere that does it like we do, particularly New Zealand. And I would say that this is this. I don't view this as an incentive, or I don't view this as a subsidy, right? I view this that generally speaking, we generally don't tax capital goods, right? We don't start applying GST on equipment and machinery and intermediate goods or things like that, or at least we then allow the manufacturing company to get that GST rebated to them back in revenue. I mean, purpose-built rental is really strange in the sense that we applied the GST to it, but we don't allow the companies to get that GST money back because rentals are GST exempt. So it's just addressing a very strange tax design that we have that doesn't really serve any useful purpose beyond raising revenue, which I suppose is a useful purpose, but it goes against that second and third goal that we have of taxation. It's very unequal, and it taxes away. It gives disproportionately bad tax treatment to things that we actually want to encourage.
Okay, we have another question that just popped up here. Could similar tax treatments to the GST help incent affordable home ownership or co-ops as well?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of, like, there's a bit of a I'm trying to remember exactly what the rules are on the co-op side. I know the GST rules are a little bit different. I do think that the ACA side can help quite a bit with not just market rate. I do think we probably need a different set of policy instruments for co-op and social housing. Like I just think that the set of problems is somewhat different, but I do think that's worth looking at and seeing how we can align those GST rules. And yeah, I'm trying to remember them because I know there's special provisions on the co-op housing side, and I can't entirely remember what they are.
The timing is perfect on these questions here. Why did the federal government move away from the ACCA or ACA and capital gain regime in the 1980s?
Yeah, so there was a few things that were happening there. So after 1972, I think it was after part of the Carter Commission, they reformed that. They introduced the MERB program and things like that. They were worried that that these were essentially being used as tax shelters for rich people. And I can understand that to a certain extent. And again, we have to worry about the equality side of the equation. But I think the pre-1972 policy was particularly well designed, where if you wanted that tax sheltering, you had to put more shovels in the ground. So, I think in retrospect that change in 1972 was a mistake. And again, they tried to rectify it. They came out with, the MER program and other such programs. But I do think that change in 72 was a big mistake.
Okay. And perfectly timed once again. Why is less government spending never an option? Every year they spend more, we get less.
Well, I don't want to speak. Certainly it is. It is an option. Yeah, I think that's kind of beyond the scope of this. But we do need to pay for that infrastructure somehow. And we can either do it through taxation, through reprioritizing spending, moving spending away from something else and to infrastructure, or we could deficit finance it. I mean, but ultimately, we do need the roads and sewers and all of the things that make communities work.
That's fair. All right. Thanks, Mike. We have one last session coming up at 4:15, so don't go anywhere. RESCON's Richard Lyall will be back to moderate a panel discussion on innovation. So again, we have a few minutes here and take a quick break, and we'll be back. So 4:15, we'll see you right back here. All right, welcome back. At this time, I'd like to hand the virtual mic back over to Richard Lyall, president of RESCON, as he will be moderating our final panel discussion of the day on innovation. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. I got to turn on my video, I think. It says unable to start video.
We can see you, I think.
Oh,
No.
Okay, that's fine.
Or maybe not. I'm looking at the wrong person here.
Goes. I got, start.
Nope, we can't see you. You're correct.
Yeah. Okay, good. We're good. Well, this has been an action-packed 4 or 5 hours. My God, my head feels like it's about to explode, but hopefully we've saved some of the most interesting bits for the last. And really what it comes down to is, how do we build all this stuff? Like as Dr. Moffat said, we're at around 100,000 units a year. We need to get to 170. And right now we're kind of trending in the wrong direction. So that's a bit of a problem. So economic history is replete with examples of where innovation has kind of saved the day. Through innovation and through sort of advanced techniques, we find new ways of doing things that enable us to produce more. So we're going to look at one element of that, which is modular housing, because it seems to have been quite popular topic. Certainly, the city of Toronto has ventured into that area with certain modular projects. They went ahead and did a number of them. Quite a few people are quite interested in it, especially when you think about certain elements, as I understand it, but I'm no expert on that. So actually, to help us with this, we do have an expert panel on different elements of this. And we want to look at, what is it, why is it, and what does it mean? Like, what does it mean for, say, for the development? Of course, we do have different elements there that social housing providers. So joining us, I'm very proud to say that we've got the president of Great Gulf Rail Rise and also the president of Home Technology, very innovative, probably the most innovative, or one of the offsite producers of housing in Canada. We also have with us Albert Densky, who is the VP of Design with BECC Modular Systems. And in addition to that, we have a firebrand by the name of Joshua Bernard in the housing world, and he is the executive vice president of development with Habitat Management, GTA. We have aligned ourselves because many of the issues that we face. So what I'm going to do is I've got 3 questions and kind of a 4th one if we can get it in. And I'm going to turn to in order to Joshua answering this question. So the first question is, so why modular housing now, offsite residential construction from their perspective? So Ted, over to you.
Richard, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm an architect by training, and my first project 40 years ago was based on a Danish mid-rise residential precast system 40 years ago, 4, 5, 6-story prefab buildings. Then while living in Sweden, I became familiar with modular and closed panel system. And then I moved to Toronto and mastered the knowledge of stick framing. Sort of a setback. To my surprise, mass construction of houses in those days was quite efficient and relatively quick. We were able to build homes in under 20 weeks in Ontario, even quicker on our sites in the US. The truth is that design was simpler, but the secrecy of efficiency was really in productivity of skilled trades. Fast forward today, we don't measure production time in days or weeks anymore. It's now months or years. Material waste is higher than ever, and labor productivity lower than ever. Both are obviously affecting negatively costs and affordability. Most of you are familiar with the McKinsey report on why the construction industry lags behind other major industries in productivity. Since 1945, productivity in manufacturing, retail, and agriculture has grown by as much as 1,500%. But in construction, productivity has barely increased at all. The report listed the following issues: delayed adoption of technology, insufficient attention to design, low adherence to collaborative planning processes, etc., etc. Our industry is fragmented and resistant to change and continuous improvement. So now to answer your question, Richard, why now? Because all the pieces of the puzzle are available. BIM, Building Information Modeling, is wide usually. BIM, besides being a tool of accuracy and collaboration, can be interfaced with CNC manufacturing equipment. Then following, manufacturing systems, equipment are available and processes established. We can learn not only from successful manufacturers of housing units on all continents, especially in Europe. We can also avoid mistakes by companies like Catera and few others, especially in the US and UK, and many of manufacturing facilities got shut down. But we learned something from it. Then, very importantly, shortage of skilled laborers continues, and after the current slowdown of construction, will most likely be more exposed to this shortage. Many trades most likely will leave the industry, and not all of them will return when the cycle will enter an upturn again. This at least has been a case in the past. The good news is, based on our experience, over 40% of our employees on the production floor, they're actually new Canadians. They arrived to Canada during the last 2 years, and they are already contributing toward the production and construction of residential units. Then, for obvious reasons, we know that demand for functional, environmental, efficient, well-designed, high performance and timely built units will grow due to the housing crisis, and will allow for steady flow of production, and steady flow of production is critical to manufacturing operation. Something important, I see a big change, among our customers even. Builders are assessing costs in a more holistic way and beyond traditional decisions by purchasing departments. Holistic assessments of cost of waste, rework, general conditions, and value of time will be supportive of off-site construction. And I believe that this will accelerate demand for our product. So, those are all the pieces of the puzzles which are just creating a great starting point for modular and any other manufactured type of a house.
Well, thanks for that, Ted. Albert, what are your thoughts? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello, Richard. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you for a great introduction and excellent speakers before us. Everyone is concerned with the same thing. How do we build affordable housing of top quality as quickly as possible? Mayor Chow, when she was asked earlier today, what's the top 3 things that we can do to build affordable housing nicely, quickly? She said speed. She started with speed. She said speed, density, dollar, and then she added land. So if I take land out of that formula, because land is more of a municipal thing, then speed and dollar, it's basically time and money, or budget and schedule. So Tad, the question is why modular and why now? I think there is nothing I can add to why now to what Tad mentioned before me. He listed everything and brilliantly. The only thing I would like to add, he said that manufacturing numbers, manufacturing, retail, and agriculture has grown by as much as 1,500% since 1945, while construction productivity barely grew. So the numbers are actually, it has declined by 1.7% from 1968. It's just mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing. So the crisis is evident. It's not a housing crisis anymore. It's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. And it's not just Canadian issue. The same numbers are coming out of the US. The same numbers are coming out of the UK, the 3 biggest residential markets probably in the Western world. So what do we do? How do we resolve it? That's the main question, and why modular? So in terms of simple logic, the question is, how do we mass produce high quality, sustainable housing in an affordable way? That's basically the question. Well, to simplify it, we do it the same way we mass produce cars or cell phones or any electronic gadgets. Those are high complexity products that have high demand for us in our everyday life. We cannot live, we cannot commute without cars. So modular, volumetric modular method of construction, one of the most advanced, probably the most advanced MMC, modern method of construction, actually provides that answer. How we mass produce top quality, sustainable, that's really important component, sustainable houses in an affordable way. So we build them off-site, the way people build cars. We build it with very well thought through design. We build it with amazing labor, highly educated labor, just like Ted has mentioned. 40% of his labor are newcomers. I would say on my design team, probably 85% of people are newcomers within 3 years, and they are contributing amazing amount of work to Canadian affordable housing crisis resolution. That's the way we resolve it. If you ask me why modular, really volumetric modular, I can go for hours. But usually to our clients, to make it simple and a little bit more, let's call it catchy way, there is a formula, 4S and 4P. And usually 4S plus 4P equals dollars. That's basically comes down to budget. So 4S's are really big. The first one is speed. Obviously, as we manufacture homes, multi-units, multi-story units, modules, in our manufacturing facility, the way BMW manufactures cars or Apple manufactures cell phones, we do it very fast, much faster than stick frame methods that are still used on our sites. So speed goes without saying. Usually on mid-size project, the reduction of site time would be 30 to 50%. Right now, we're looking to 15 to 17-story high-rise buildings. We're looking at 70% of time reduction on site, which brings me to the second huge S, sustainability. I mean, construction industry accounts for roughly 40% of CO2 emissions, of the total CO2 emissions in the world from 2022. It's just like we are the worst people on earth. We are really, really not good for Mother Earth. Modular, volumetric modular, any off-site solution answers that with huge positive reduction. It's a zero wastage. It's reduction in embodied carbon into our modules, and then reduction of the site works. The third S is safety. Again, not too many people know that, but around 50% of all fatal work injuries in the United States are attributed with the site works in construction. Accidents like that are probably near zero in modular construction. And the fourth S is selection. Maybe people think that modular is some kind of refugee camps or mining camps. Of course, there are markets like that, but modern modular is endless selection of beautiful projects that are not limiting architectural imagination, that are not limiting any functional requirements that are out there by developers or by, let's say, medical facilities, if we're talking about LTCs. So selection is endless. 4Ps quickly is predictability. What you see is what you get. You come to buy your car, you select a certain model, you are 100% confident that you will receive exactly the same product. That's how it works with modular. We design the module, we create mock-up, people come to our factory, and that's what they get. Precision. Obviously, we're working not with architectural or construction precision, we're working with manufacturing precision, which is 1.52 millimeters, 1/16th of an inch. And then, of course, there is beam design platforms that Tad previously mentioned, and not to mention AI tools, which we are, for example, actively using in our work. And then there is productivity. Again, we already mentioned how productive could be newcomers and how productive is manufacturing style of work. And then very important thing that people often forget is preparedness. It's kind of, we are able to be prepared way ahead of time, knowing final specs and knowing what's happening on site. And we all heard about supply chain interruptions. And this is not just COVID. Things that are happening in the world are not very positive, and definitely supply chain connections are interrupted. Having modular helps us to be fully prepared for that. I hope it answers, at least in part, why modular.
Well, that exceeded my expectations. I like the way you put it, 4S and 4P. Now I'll go to Joshua now, and Joshua's got a slightly different take on things, I think, or at least no. But Joshua, what's your view of this? Why now?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, so I've just enjoyed listening to the two other panelists because theirs is way more kind of precise, laser focused and calculated. Ours is really about as habitat necessity. It's not a question of and we're not as kind of, you know, thoughtful and calculated as probably the rest of the industry. And it's just for us, you know, we have a site right now where we have we're building 50 stacked towns. We have 50 different trades on site, plus to add in a little bit more kind of complexity, you know, 15 to 30 volunteers on site every day. And they're framing, they're insulating, they're doing a bunch of different stuff. So from a safety perspective, you know, that's a huge element for us, as well as looking at, you know, volunteers don't necessarily want to frame in the winter or in the rain. So, you know, we've successfully framed 38 homes in 38 days with a volunteer kind of group of about 50 people per day. And that was wildly successful for us, especially given the fact that these volunteer groups actually pay to participate in it's a team building exercise. So we're able to provide kind of, you know, more certainty around when the day is, because you don't know if something's going to happen that's going to delay you. So providing more certainty to those individuals, but also from a safety perspective, and just having a controlled environment. And then the last thing is, you know, man, it's harder to get building permits and you know, everything lined up. And usually projects are delayed years. So this way we're not having to wait to start framing a building. You know, we have our permits, maybe the foundation's going in, we can start framing off site. So it's something that we're looking at moving forward, not because it's going to necessarily save us money, but just because it's necessary for us to meet the kind of demand that we need to meet. So a lot shorter of an answer, but I think again, yeah.
That's good. In fact, I was just going to add quickly to add to what you're saying, and I think I get is we've got a meeting next week now coming up with students housing, and offsite modular could be an ideal solution to that area, because you can actually have completely finished units delivered to site. Now, of course, the facilities and equipment and everything that's required to establish, you know, or create the production capability to produce these things, a whole other thing, because there's capital, serious capital investments there that are, you know, would go into this, and it's not insignificant at all from what I can see. So the second question is, what do, you know, we've talked about in this program about the various levels of government, what they're doing, what they should do, and so on and so forth. We heard from Mayor Chow, and Mike Moffat is very close at the federal level. He was there briefing them. So what is it that governments need to do to encourage this, make it happen? Because, you know, from my point of view, when I look at the numbers of what we need to do, like, this is a necessity, and we need to ramp up very quickly. And you know, what Albert said, all those very good reasons, and of course Ted too, but you know, all those very good reasons for, you know, the obvious benefits. So I'm going to go with the same circuit again. I'll start with Ted. Ted, what is government? And you can pick your level of government or all levels of government. What do they need and could do to make this happen, to increase our offsite production capability?
You know, any financial assistance and favorable tax measures are always helpful. But perhaps we should consider the government role and help with R&D funding. You know, on one hand, our industry is advanced. On the other hand, we are still, you know, at the very early stage of overall education. So there's a role for academia here as well. That's for sure. Our relationships with universities and colleges could be deployed here, okay? Perhaps the innovation parks, similar to something what DRE has in Watford in England. This could establish the direction for improvement of efficiency of the industry. We're looking for a product which won't compromise quality of housing. This is very, very important that, right off the get-go, we start something with what a few minutes ago Albert described as a sustainable, solid, precise, predictable product. Okay, we need R&D support. Perhaps we could look into large demonstration building exhibition parks, similar to parks in Stockholm, in Vienna, where manufacturers are presenting their products. This is still educational. We still are trying, to show off our industry. We are expecting developers to drive the demand for prefab units, but builders, including large American, even public companies, typically don't have R&D departments. There's a number of reasons. We don't have time to discuss it now. But we are talking about integrated technology demonstration, testing and training. This could grow this industry. Certainly, government could encourage investment in the off-site manufacturing sector by providing long-term contracts to qualify candidates. And I have seen positive results of this kind of programs in Europe. Sweden had a great experience, and fantastic facility was based on the assumption that the pipeline of orders will be full. And as far as I'm concerned, this probably would be the biggest thing which government could do for us to support long-term investment and long-term production. Thanks.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah. No. And you know what? We're cramming a topic in here into a half an hour. That's absolutely impossible to do. And I was going to say, one of the things we might consider doing an entirely separate session on this, or a series of over a period of time, because it really does deserve that. And we're actually, I was going to say incidentally, is that we're looking at maybe, and I was going to ask what you might think about this too, but before I go to Albert, is to have some kind of like a RESCON modular council with a specific focus in this area, because I think it's needed, because there's so much to it. But Albert, let me turn to you before I blather on. What do you think government can do? And
try to be quick. I understand we're a bit short of time. I think government has to learn. Okay, I think there are a lot of good intentions in what they're doing. I just think they don't know how to deal with this new, we call it MMC, methods of construction, which most of them are off-site solutions. They just don't know. Practically every week, 2-3 times a month, we're meeting with governmental officials that are coming to our manufacturing facility, to our design studio, and asking us questions that are really, they floor me. It shows that the level of not even misunderstanding, of lack of knowledge is unbelievable. How to start the process? How do we design? And we're going out, we're trying to educate as much as we can, and this session is part of this kind of educational attempt. But government has to understand that you cannot resolve existing crisis with the old tools. And in order to use new tools, you have to learn how to use them. All right. If tomorrow you're receiving new software, you're not starting to use it the same way you used your previous software. You have to learn it. You have to take some course. You have to check some exercises, and then you do it. So I would love government. Maybe they have to create some special departments. They have to assign special teams. They have to create some collaborations with experts and specialists like ourselves to understand the sequencing of the process, the logic of the process, and how to make sure that they're using it in the most efficient way. We're here to help. your idea of forming some kind of council or a group that will be that bridge between the governmental organizations and us, manufacturers, designers, builders. It's a brilliant idea. So I encourage everyone, if we have people from government, to listen to us, and we will gladly help. Thank you.
Thanks, Albert. Joshua, I think last word to you, because we're go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I think the nonprofit sector is the greatest opportunity to take advantage of modular and offsite panelization. I think in order for that to happen, we need long-term sustained funding invested by the government into housing. So a 1 or 2 year program. The challenge with like the Rapid Housing Initiative program, which was, you know, it came out and it had to be done within 12 to 18 months, it was great for the projects that were already in the pipeline that have already selected modular, but it wasn't a realistic timeline. And so if, like, you know, there is an opportunity with modular, government should invest in funding modular projects, but that funding needs to be a 5 to 8 year commitment, specifically in cities like Toronto or Vancouver, where it just takes longer to get something done.
Good point. Thank you for that. And I think I'll ask, are we out of time? I don't know if we are, but I think
we have 1 minute.
1 minute left. Okay, so the other question I had that I was going to look at is sort of what's the best area to start, but I think we've kind of answered that. Joshua, you've answered that in your own way, and I think Ted to a certain degree, and Albert, like, you know, the long-term sustained support for this, long-term contracts. So someone's going to invest in plants or facilities that need to have a forward outlook of X thousands of units, you know, over time, then where's the market for it? And that's where I think the modular combined with certain, you know, like, for example, what you were talking about, Josh, or students housing or whatever else like that, but maybe might be ideal. But with the last 30 seconds, anybody got a quick comment on that? Oh, and by the way, there's Q&A too. There's some questions there. I'll encourage the speakers to have a look at them. I think a couple were directed at Albert, but you know what? I think we're out of time. I talked too long. So Albert, Ted, Joshua, I want to thank you for coming on, and sorry about, you know, we could have talked about this for hours, and I think we will later on this evening, those who are going to be attending our dinner, but I want to thank you again, and you know, it's been a great day, and I'm going to turn it over to Corinne to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to our panelists. I have to agree, though, Richard's right, that modular is a really big and really interesting topic to tackle, especially at the end of the day. So thank you for highlighting the key elements. And yes, there are some questions in the Q&A there. So if our panelists have a moment, they can hop in and see if they can tackle answering those. Speaking of the end of the day, we do have a final video presentation from Tony Irwin, who's president and CEO of the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, FRPO. So with 2,200 members, FRPO is the leading advocate for quality rental housing in Ontario. So don't go anywhere yet. Just a last few minutes here, and don't want to miss any good stuff. So can we please play that video?
I'm Tony Irwin, president and CEO of the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, and interim president of the Canadian Federation of Apartment Associations. FRPO has been the leading voice of Ontario's rental housing industry for over 30 years, with over 2,200 members who own and or manage more than 350,000 rental homes across Ontario. We are pleased to be a sponsor of today's Housing Summit, organized by Richard Lyall and the RESCON team. Today, we heard from many speakers with a variety of experiences and backgrounds that relate to driving solutions to the housing crisis. I would like to extend my appreciation to all elected officials who participated in today's discussion, with a special thanks to Premier Ford. We also heard from experts from academia, industry, nonprofits, and economists alike, all interested in unlocking more housing that is desperately needed right across Canada. Before we close today's summit, I'd like to share some ideas FRPO continues to advocate for as we seek to create the conditions to address the rental housing shortage in the province of Ontario. We recently submitted a revised 10-point Ontario rental housing strategy to the Honourable Paul Coandra, Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. Our recommendations focus on specific measures to incent more purpose-built rental. To address zoning and fast-track approvals, FRPO recommends the creation of an as-of-right zoning framework to fast-track infill development on existing rental sites that can accommodate additional buildings. A density and height bonus to help purposeful rental compete with more lucrative condominium projects for land. And a separate queue with dedicated resources to fast-track appeals for purposeful rental proposals at the Ontario Land Tribunal. We're also advocating for financial incentives, including rebates for development charges, community benefits charges, and parkland levies aimed at unlocking more mid-market rental projects. We were very pleased to see commitments to move on HST by both doors of government. But we are calling for GST and HST to be zero rated in order to greenlight even more purposeful rental developments. We also asked to remove prohibitive regulations to incent the development of more low to mid-rise apartments. These include issues such as double egress, parking minimums, setbacks, floor space index, and other prohibitive requirements. In addition, we asked the minister to give consideration to the impact operating conditions have on the viability of purposeful rental development in the province. Specifically, we asked the minister to ensure the rent increase guideline for pre-2018 units is aligned with Ontario's CPI, to maintain the current rental policy regime that governs above guideline increases, vacancy decontrol, and the post-2018 exemption, and last but not least, to ensure that the Landlord and Tenant Board meets its own service standards. Forums like today are essential to keep the policy conversation going, to promote and advance solutions to solve Ontario's housing crisis. Once again, a big thank you to Richard Lyall and the RESCON team for organizing today's summit. This concludes our Housing Summit 3.0. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thanks again, and good night.
On behalf of RESCON and myself, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for making the time today in their schedules to be here with us. We have been fortunate to hear a range of perspectives, elected officials, economists, researchers, and although there is clearly still a lot of work ahead of us, there's also good reason to be optimistic. We've heard several potential solutions, but perhaps the most positive emphasis today has been around collaboration. RESCON 3.0 is living proof that collaboration across the sector and innovation, whether it is modular or something else, is what's needed to boost new housing and fast. Before we officially close the summit, I'd like to extend one final thank you to today's sponsors for making this event possible: the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, FRPO, the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, and Stories. We look forward to welcoming you back next year to RESCON Housing Summit 4.0. Thanks for joining us. And before you sign off, please take a few moments to fill out the post-event survey that's available in the chat. Have a great evening.